Good morning. Good morning. All right, there we go. Welcome to our symposium on AI and cancer, how we actually are going to realize the promise of AI to improve cancer research and clinical care. As we set things up, there's a few housekeeping details that we want to cover. Some of these are the very important things for the restrooms. There's a hallway that leads out the center of the auditorium. The restrooms are down the hall, and I forget if it's left or right, but go down the hall to the left or the right, the restrooms are there. There's also stairs just behind the walls in the auditorium, which will take you down to restrooms as well. So that's the first important housekeeping detail. We have the Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi is appropriately called AI at Hood, so it's there if you want to use the Wi-Fi. Another item is that evidently some people may take calls during the day, and Hood College is very supportive of that. There are meeting rooms out behind the auditorium as well, so if you have a need to take a call or a meeting or something during the course of the symposium, don't hesitate, go out the back. There's rooms off to the sides that you can go find your quiet space so you can have your meetings. And another thing to share is that we are recording today. So the reason that we are recording today is because we ultimately will be producing a report from the symposium. So that's one of the things it's doing, and we are actually going live. We're live streaming. So there are people that are not even in this room that are going to benefit from the presentations, the questions, and the discussions that you all have. So, all right. Wow. We finally did it. This symposium has been on the calendar for a long time. We started it before the thing called COVID, and then we went through COVID, and what an exciting line of presenters we have. These presenters are special. They have stuck with us through the COVID, through the delays, as we rescheduled and really wanted to have this symposium in person. The in person is important because of the collaborations and the opportunities to meet each other. And I really want to thank our presenters for what they've done to stick with us through this delay and get to this point, and how we are going to be able to talk in this room and understand and explore the ways that AI and how we're going to actually turn that promise to reality. I want to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors are very important to us. We have HPE, which I formerly knew as Cray, for their platinum level visionary sponsorship. We have Samba Nova for their gold level innovator sponsorship, as well as Leidos Biomedical Research. We also have Leidos Corporate to thank for their silver level sponsorship, because without those sponsors, we would not have the symposium today, we would not have the presenters here today. So let's all thank our sponsors for making this possible. Our sponsors, some of them are here today, so sponsors, raise your hands and get connected to the people that you've helped bring here today. None of this would be possible without a fantastic team. I'd like to recognize Len Friedman, the Chief Science Officer of Frederick National Lab, for his co-leadership in putting the symposium together. Len has been keeping us on track and going forward throughout those delays and helping make those tough decisions of should we, shouldn't we, should we go virtual, should we go hybrid, and ultimately bringing us here today with what we have. I also want to recognize Monica Slate, Deborah Ricker, Lori Ward, Britton Muir for making the logistics work. For without them, this would also not happen. I'd like to call out Lynn Borkin and Patrina Hollingsworth for efforts, even long before the symposium, in building the community around the computing innovations, and then leveraging that community to bring you all together today. That community is one of the things that we can take advantage of going forward. So if you are interested in joining the Envisioning Computational Innovations for Cancer Challenges community, talk to Lynn, talk to Patrina, and then you can sustain the collaborations that you start today. I'd also like to thank our advisory committee for the insights on important and timeless topics. We didn't know how timeless they were when they were suggested, but they've lasted through the delays. Jonas Almeida from NCI, Peter Troike from NCI, Ethan Dimitrowski from FNLCR, as well as Leonard Freeman from FNLCR. Marty Head, who started the advisory committee when she was at Oak Ridge and is now at Amgen. Warren Kibbe from Duke, and whose time here at NCI was truly pivotal in bringing us together today. Daniel Rubin, Amber Simpson from Queen's University in Canada. So we're now an international symposium, which is fantastic. And Kristen Swanson from Mayo Clinic. I also want to thank our keynote presenter, Keith Yamamoto, for what is a wonderful presentation to help set the stage for the topics and the items and the things that we will discuss today. And finally, again, to our presenters who are going to fill out that program and provide so much insight, so much content, so many things to react to in this place. This place is going to be special when we leave. All right, a few points about the symposium. Relax. We want this to be an in-person, casual symposium. I may not look very relaxed up here. I'm not, but that's okay. We're all going to relax. We waited to be in person for a reason, so we can build those collaborations, to take advantage of the opportunities, and build those networks and those opportunities that we have to really explore those collaborations that happen only when you talk in different ways to different people from different disciplines. Be truly transdisciplinary, as was being mentioned last night, and really bring things together. Last night reception was an example of that. It was fantastic. It was good food. It was great conversation and great people. I got to meet some new collaborators that I hope to develop relationships with, and I hope you did too, if you were able to attend last night's reception. And if you were not able to, please meet someone at this symposium today. As I mentioned, we are recording the presentations. We are scribing the breakout sessions to prepare that report. So please be open, share your thoughts, so we can add depth to that report and the content that can be used to share with others that are not able to join us today. We have activities planned to keep things interesting, opportunities to interact. During lunch, we're going to be asking you for your input. AI in cancer research and clinical care is a big, broad topic, and we only have one day, and we're not going to cover everything. So we're going to give you opportunities to share ideas about what are the things that we didn't cover, so we can include those in the report. All right, and now, it is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Doug Loy, the Acting Director of the NCI, Principal Deputy Director, the Chief of the Laboratory of Cellular Oncology within the NCI Center for Cancer Research. Doug's contributions are many to the field, so many in the role of the human papillomavirus, in vaccines, and understanding cancer growth, and bringing these insights to the clinic. Today, I would actually like to highlight Doug's pivotal role in fostering and supporting the early collaboration between the NCI and the DOE. That collaboration was the basis at which we ultimately are coming here today and coming together to talk. It is my pleasure to introduce Doug Loy.
Eric, thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm going to, in my 7 minutes of fame, I am going to talk really about three things. First, some of activities that NCI is involved with related to artificial intelligence. Second, to briefly touch on the collaboration we have with the Department of Energy that Eric just mentioned. And third, to talk about the issue of cancer health disparities and artificial intelligence, but in general with technology development. So when Ned Sharpless was the NCI director, he and Tony Kurlevage published a paper last year about the potential of AI in cancer care and research. And I've highlighted for you some of the areas that they mentioned. You know, one is to generate large publicly available curated data sets. Two, shifting the culture of data sharing so that it is truly sharing. Three, fostering interdisciplinary collaborations. Four, training the next generation in AI and in cancer sciences. Then investing in research to improve AI methods and models designed specifically for cancer, and sponsoring workshops dealing with specific aspects of AI. The collaboration with the Department of Energy really is a win-win-win situation. It's a win for NCI, a win, I hope, for the Department of Energy, but especially a win for patients who have cancer. It brings together two largely non-overlapping areas of expertise, and we in the cancer area take advantage of the high technological capabilities of the Department of Energy, specifically at the various national laboratories. There's the predictive modeling for preclinical screening, improving the outcomes for RAS-related cancers. I'm not going to mention that because Fred Streitz is going to be talking later this morning about that collaboration. And I will talk just for one slide about population information integration analysis and modeling and precision surveillance for the SEER program, which is the nationwide program that monitors the cancer incidence for different populations throughout the United States. And then the accelerating therapeutics and opportunities in medicine, ATOM, that Eric is actually very strongly involved with. So automation in SEER, Gina Taurasi, who leads this at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, is here, but her colleague, Anuj Kapadia, is going to be giving a talk later this morning and probably will touch on this. But let me just highlight from my perspective how, thanks to this collaboration, we are in the process of making SEER, which already is the envy of cancer registries throughout the world, even better. And particularly helping SEER to go from being manually uploading for the information of the hundreds of thousands of cases in SEER to becoming far more automated, using natural language processing, very sophisticated for doing this. And the most advanced area currently is with pathology records. And they are very heterogeneous, but thanks to Dr. Taurasi and her colleagues, with the input from Lynn Permurthy at NCI, they have been able to develop an API for auto extraction of key elements for pathology. And to me, the most exciting part is it's an automated process that is about 18,000 times faster than manual extraction. It currently is able to fully automate about 1 in 5 of the path reports, with the goal to get up to 1 and 2. But if you look on the right, currently they're modifying this API for use in radiology reports and also for recurrent metastatic disease, with the ultimate goal being to support near real-time incidence reporting. The last topic I want to mention really is technology and health disparities, which Dr. Yamamoto discussed last night as well. From my perspective, technology can decrease disparities, increase disparities, or be neutral. To increase the likelihood of a technological development decreasing disparities, I think it's critical to consider the disparities from the beginning of the process. Don't wait until the end to consider the possible impact on disparities. Even more direct, develop technology whose goal includes reducing disparities. And my last slide is to give you an example from my NCI colleague, Mark Schiffman, who over the last few years has developed what I think is going to be the first cost-effective, high-quality see and treat approach for cervical cancer screening. It is currently undergoing large-scale international clinical trials, and this is appropriate for low and middle-income countries as well as for high-income countries. It has 3 parts. First, rapid, inexpensive on-site HPV DNA test. And for the context here for this meeting, an on-site automated visual evaluation of the cervix with a smartphone and a built-in AI algorithm for the HPV positive women. And within seconds after taking the picture, the operator is told whether the woman who is HPV positive should be treated with on-site thermal ablation. So this is using, if you will, high-tech AI for doing something on the ground in low and middle income countries. So I think that really this conference brings together a lot of disparate elements related to artificial intelligence, talking also about the relationship to health disparities, but really with a cancer research focus. And so I really applaud the Frederick National Laboratory for organizing the conference with this theme, and look forward to really an excellent 2 days. Thank you very much.
Lynn told me I'm moderating, so I just always listen to Lynn. Oh, 2? My PhD in computer science is going to come in handy today, I can tell. So excited to be here, everyone. My first in-person conference since this whole pandemic happened, so I'm still reorienting myself to being in person, but this is super exciting. So I get to introduce myself. My name is Amber Simpson. I'm the moderator for this session. I'm a Canada Research Chair from Queen's University, just up the interstate up in Canada, just past Syracuse, about an hour or so. So not too far away. So international, but neighbors. And I hold lots of other appointments. I'm also a senior investigator with the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, which I'll talk a little bit about. I'm also a member of the Vector Institute for AI. The Vector Institute is our Toronto-based group that was started by Jeffrey Hinton, who is one of the Turing Award winners for deep learning, to sort of operationalize artificial intelligence. So really happy to be here. I've been involved with the NCI DOE folks for a few years now, and I always really enjoy these meetings. So I have nothing to disclose, although I am a member of NIH study section. So some themes for what I'm going to talk about over the next 30 minutes. Linking back to our session, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI for hypothesis generation, cancer digital twins, and crowdsourced challenges. So my perspective, so I came from Memorial Sloan Kettering. I was on the faculty there for a few years, which is how I got to know a few of you. So Memorial is a high-volume cancer center. They have rich, deep data on cancer patients, genomics, imaging, et cetera. They don't tend to have normal patients, though, right? They don't tend to have the non-cancer patients. Very single institution closed data that's difficult to share. My newer experience is in Canada with the Canadian Cancer Trials Group as one example. So the Canadian Cancer Trials Group coordinates and centralizes cancer trials across Canada, and we partner substantially with EORTC and NCI to execute these trials across the world. And interestingly, we centralize specimen and data for all of those trials within our mothership, which is located at my institution. And in the next 5 years, we're actually building a data science platform so that people can actually use the nice, rich data that's generated on these clinical trials. And then I also have this experience of working with Ontario, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, looking at population-level data within a single-payer health system for 14 million Ontarians, and our experience with building a data platform for research. And so I've seen data in different ways, in different depths and in different breadths, and so that's kind of informed what I'm going to talk about today. So most of what I do in my lab is image analysis, so we tend to take images like this is a liver CT of a patient undergoing chemotherapy, and we mine this information for predictive biomarkers. And so we do a lot of work in the standardization of these biomarkers. We're NIH funded for this. We have a nice grant with MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Kettering to really drill into making robust biomarkers that we can evaluate in clinical trials. I'm also involved in other NCI-funded activities looking at correlative studies and imaging biomarker design. We have a really nice trial in cholangiocarcinoma, which we've developed nice imaging biomarkers for. And we've done the same thing in pancreas cancer and pancreatic cysts. So again, NCI funded. This was led by Peter Allen out of Duke. And again, so nice correlative studies looking at genomics and radiomics within a well-defined patient population. But what I want to talk about in this talk specifically is real-world evidence in medicine, and the idea of using non-randomized studies to support inference regarding treatment effectiveness. So thinking about real-world evidence, it's been proposed as a complementary source of evidence that can better capture treatments as used in routine care. And so the idea is that, we're generating all of this data as patients, and how can we take that data, whether it's from wearables, disease registries, survey data, for us, census data in Canada and other resources, and put those together into biomarkers and into real-world medicine to drive change for cancer patients. And so the question that we pose is, can we use AI to derive real-world evidence? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about image segmentation first. So this is a seminal problem in my field. It's one of the hardest problems that we have, and it's given an image, determine what's in that image. And of course, everybody's familiar with this now because, so we're talking about the object recognition problem, which is for 30 years, it's been the hardest problem in our field, 40 years, 50 years. I think it was in the 1950s that Marvin Minsky posed this problem. He thought it was gonna be a project for his summer student, and it turned out to be a decades-long problem. And it was solved recently, and it was solved and has made self-driving cars a reality. And so it was solved using open science. And the Visual Object Classes Challenge, which was 10 years ago now, given an image, determined what's in that image, and it generated 10 million images with labels. And we called that ImageNet. And that really revolutionized deep learning. It made deep learning possible. It made all of these other things possible that just really didn't exist over 10 years ago. And so we came together to build an ImageNet for medical imaging. And so I brought this forward as an idea because I was sitting on so much data from Memorial that I didn't have even enough time to get to all of it. So we opted to share the data. And it was a challenge at our big prestigious conference in 2018. And the goal of it was to develop a semantic algorithm, so one that required no input from a person, and solve 10 different segmentation tasks, so 10 different organs of interest or tumors of interest, without any kind of human involvement, right? And your algorithm had to be able to be given new data and then learn that data without changing the actual underlying code. And the idea, again, is ImageNet for medical images, and you can download this data now. And what we found was that the best algorithm achieved state-of-the-art performance across multiple regions of interest, organs, and tumors. And at the time, that was pretty phenomenal that we could have a single algorithm, a single network do that. And so the legacy of this has been strong. So this was actually included in NVIDIA's Clara healthcare platform, which is rolls out in all of the SDKs for NVIDIA devices. It's now part of MONAI. And it generated NNUNet, which is still the best medical image segmentation algorithm that there is, and nothing compares to it. And everyone's making small changes to it, but generally speaking, this is the thing that everyone's trying to beat. And we're now to the point that image segmentation is, I would say, an almost solved problem. It's certainly solved within certain cancers, certain tumor types, and that we're getting to automatic RECIST and things like that. And then we've recently participated in some of the federated learning challenges as well, so to take this to the next step. And there's a really great, so federated learning is this concept that instead of moving data around, you move models around, right? So that means that I can keep my data at Queens, UPenn can keep their data at UPenn, and then we just move these networks around. And so UPenn led a federated tumor segmentation challenge called FETS, and they did it for GBM segmentation. And it involved, almost every continent. And this was actually just accepted to Nature Communications, but it really tremendously showed that GBM segmentation is basically solved now. And we solved it by using crowdsourcing, and we solved it by using federated learning. And so all of these concepts of you know, silos of data and things like that, those are things that you and I think about, but I can tell you that my undergrads don't think about it at all. My grad students don't think about it at all. They're just by default sharing data, sharing algorithms. They're used to being on social media. So I see that these silos that we've had historically are just gonna fall over the next few years, if not already. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NLP of Radiology Reports, and it was great to have Dr. Loy give us a little bit of a rundown. And so data is king, and I think that's part of the reason why we're all here today. And so we have this nice paper that we reported in Radiology looking at metastatic disease patterns in patients from radiology reports over a 10-year period. And so this is our attempt to develop a cancer digital twin. So a cancer twin, if you're unaware, is basically a digital replica of a patient. So we sought to leverage natural language processing and imaging reports and create a map of disease burden for machine learning. And so we can generate this really beautiful database of response and progression across all different cancer primaries and cancer metastases sites. And so this was an attempt to address the issue that RECIST are not really available outside of clinical trials. They can be sometimes, but generally speaking, they're not available outside of clinical trials. So RECIST are published rules for assessing disease burden by imaging. And they came about because oncologists needed a reproducible way to tell whether somebody had responded to chemotherapy or not. And so it's performed by a radiologist, separate from the radiology report, and it really relies on the concept of image segmentation. So they have to identify in the baseline scan the tumor of interest. They have to measure that with a unidimensional ruler. And then there are some criteria for categorizing stable progression, partial or complete response. And so this limits our understanding of response rates in the general cancer population, because it's really only performed on patients in clinical trials, because it's extremely time consuming for a radiologist to do. And it also means that knowledge of response rates across the general population is pretty limited. It's pretty limited to these individual trials where strict inclusion and exclusion criteria define who enters that trial, right? So we sought to solve this problem. And so Sloan Kettering has 700,000 structured reports back to 2009. I think we're over 1 million now in this project. I think at the time we started, it was at 400,000. And they really invested in the concept. And they actually did this for operational reasons. They didn't even do it for research reasons back in 2009. They just wanted to make their reporting better. So they invested in the idea of structured reports, and the radiology department agreed upon a structure for those reports. And so this is an example report on the left. We see all of the different metastases sites, and then we see a description. And all of that is done by structured reporting, so it's pull-down menus and things like that. And then there's a nice free text section at the end if they do need to add something, and that's called the impression section. And so what we endeavored to do was to take this and label it so that we could actually track which metastases were in each image, or in which report. And so this means that for each patient, we had many, many scans, because cancer patients get scanned constantly over time, right? And then we had treatments, demographics, and outcome. And so first, as a first step, we took, at the time it was about 420,000 reports, and we took a subset and we manually annotated them so that we could tell whether we were actually getting everything right. So we had this nice tool at Sloan Kettering that we could use to get the reports annotated. The radiologists could go in really easily and do that work. And we built an NLP model. It's actually my 2 students that did this. It's not a very sophisticated model, but gets tremendously good performance. We took those manually annotated reports, we split them into test and training, we did the usual thing, and we built a model. And then we validated those on a validation set. And then we took that and we ran all 400,000 or so reports through it to generate all of these labels for all of these metastases sites. And the idea was that that would generate a final map of metastatic disease across all patients. And so these are the metastases distribution by primary cancer. So you can see all the primary cancers down the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you can see all of the different sites of metastases. And so again, this is across 400,000, now over 1 million different really nice reports that were generated. We can also do things like look at patterns of metastatic spread across different primary cancers. This leads to a whole visualization of data issue in this project. Okay, so I'm going to bring this back around to real-world evidence, which is what started this whole thing. So now we have this NLP algorithm that lets us map all this data, right? So we took this and we actually compared survival plots that we could create on the fly in real time based on this NLP model that we have with actual staging systems. And so this is an example on the right is our NLP-based staging system for colorectal cancer patients, and on the left is the standard staging system. We can do things like real-time survival curves. So we had a group of folks from the melanoma group that asked us if we could interrogate the data because they thought they saw something in some patients that had liver metastases. And so we were actually able to, on the fly, generate survival curves for them of all their patients. So if you think about how clinical research usually works, usually you have a fellow or a resident. Hopefully you have a database, but typically that database has holes in it, right? So you have to get a fellow or a resident to go through and start manually curating data. It used to be, I'm told, 50 years ago that clinical reports were on 50 patients because that's how many you could go down to the basement and manually flip through the charts and you could get 50 patients, right? Now that number's up to more like 1,000 because you can have these fellows, fill in the gaps in all these data. But what this is letting us do is now looking at, orders of magnitude more patients within those records, and to do it with a high degree of accuracy. We've also looked at, improving our detection if we consider consecutive reports. So we can do this with a great deal of accuracy. We've compared it with some of the manual approaches. And so it's really kind of something that now they're using it to define clinical trials. So it's maybe not something that you want to use to answer all your questions, but now you can say, okay, we have this idea, we've looked at the data, now we can generate a cancer trial based on that cohort of patients because we know the survival outcomes. We can start doing things like add in the actual images and look at true response rates, right? Because now we have that auto-segmentation piece in the first part. We can get past RECIST criteria and sort of the manual approach that we've done for many years to actually look at true response rates. So instead of relying necessarily on the radiology report, we could actually measure it across all of these images. And something that we're working on right now, so there's a subset of patients that have cancers of unknown primary. So those patients aren't eligible for targeted therapies because we don't know what their primary is. So we're working right now to take our data and look back in time and see if we can actually figure out what these primaries are, which will let us create models that will predict a primary for an incoming patient, which I think is a really exciting thing to do. And again, this is all about generating hypotheses that could then be tested in clinical trials and perhaps expedite clinical research and important questions that need to be asked. And so, of course, all of this is towards this idea of population-level health data, which in my mind is where the real-world evidence comes in, right? That's when we can look at these drugs outside of trials and see how things interact and see really what these true response rates are. Of course, there's the siloification of health data, right? And that's certainly true in the US, and it's even true in Canada. But we're trying to get past it. So I moved back to Canada. This is my health card. This tells you how old I am because it's a really old health card. But this thing links me in the province of Ontario. It gives me a medical record number that follows me everywhere, and so that my data can be linked. And actually, my colleague is going to talk a little bit more about this later. But it's really this concept that we have this unique ID, right? And that we've invested in this idea. And so Ontario as a province is a single-payer insurance, which is OHIP. And our hospitals are not-for-profit private corporations, so that's a bit of a different situation than here in the US. But it offers a unique opportunity around health data. And so in response to COVID-19, we actually created a health data platform for looking at COVID-19 questions. And so this is access to health data for 14 million people in Ontario. It's a massively high-performance compute cluster. And the data governance, which is the really important piece about all of this, all of these discussions about data, that's all taken care of by the Ministry of Health, because they're the ones that sort of own the data in a sense. And this is all located at my university. But the idea is that you'd be able to take in hospital data, physician data, pharmacy data, diagnostic imaging, and put it all together. This is, similar to the UCSF concept that we were talking about last night. We're not near finished building this thing, but it has shown some benefit in the pandemic. And certainly the pandemic has shown and highlighted the need for data science. So I'm not sure that AI really revolutionized anything during the pandemic, but it certainly highlighted the need for data and the reliance that we all have on health data to make informed decisions every day. And I'm going to wrap up, and I just wanted to give a shout out to, there's another session today where ethics and that kind of thing and bias are going to be discussed. There's some really nice work going on by my postdoc, Lana James. She looks at race correction. And so I didn't know race correction was a thing, but so we do things in the medical record like correct laboratory values based on skin color. And so we do that. It happens for your kidney function tests, which means that black patients aren't eligible for transplants. So that's a problem, and so this is race correction, and then that gets baked into all of these algorithms that we attempt to make on top of this data. And so what I've learned from Lana is that the data are already really biased. We talked about that a little bit last night, and that I always thought, as a data scientist, I always thought if we got the right data, if we got it all together, if we had enough of it, we would be right, we would do the right things, and that's just not true, right? The data is inherently biased, and that's a problem. And then the other thing we're thinking a lot about is decolonization of data. So Canada has an unfortunate history with our Indigenous populations, so we have brought in an expert in Indigenous-led data governance and sovereignty to look at the intersections of decolonization. And we have a nice partnership with Native Biodata Consortium, which is a group in South Dakota, who is aiming to repatriate specimen and data from Indigenous populations across the US into their repositories, because self-determination is an important feature for Indigenous folks. And so with that, I'll end. I always say this at the end of my talks, but I try to be this bridge between the computational community and the clinical community, and I try to find solutions that make sense for patients. I'm probably drowning somewhere in the water down below, but I'm trying to build that bridge, and that's really the hope of all this. And then, of course, a final note that I'm at the point now where I only use a word processor and an internet browser, and it's all my students and postdocs and staff that do all the work, so a shout out to them for the brilliant work they do. And with that, I'll stop, and yeah, we have time for questions, and I got us back on schedule. Thanks so much.
So you told us about this idea that your students no longer look for private data, but they go for the public open data. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about what happens to the models. Are there platforms, model hubs, where you see the same sort of movement touch the models themselves?
Yeah, you see a big push in communities to share code and share models now. I'm not sure how useful the models are, to be honest, because if the data changes, if how the data were acquired changes, then that's going to have an impact on model performance. I would say, so we do a mix. We still use private data. I still get a lot of data from Sloan Kettering, but then now we're trying to think about that, think about how we could get more representative data of a whole population. It's hard though, you need to publish things, and so that closed data is still really high quality. And I think too, I always say this, but I think a reason why I've had success in oncology is through jealousy. So I show oncologists what we can do with their data, and then what we could do if they gave us their data, and then they say, okay, you need to use our data. So I feel like the more that we have these discussions and we show the power of the data, then more data is being released now. And I think, going forward. But I also worry we're a little bit on the not so great side of history by putting all this data out there. So That's why as a province, we're starting to make closed health data platforms. So you get access as a trusted researcher. You get access to the full data. It's like the biobank, right? The UK biobank, similar concept. So you can work with that data. You have a high performance compute cluster within that data, but you can't take the data out. So I don't know, there's a lot to think about. Any more questions? If not, we can move on to the next speaker. Caroline Chung. So I'll introduce you, Caroline, while you make your way up here. So Caroline is the Vice President, Chief Data Officer, and Associate Professor in Radiation Oncology and Diagnostic Imaging at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Her clinical practice is focused on CNS malignancies, and her computational imaging lab has a research focus on quantitative imaging and modeling to detect, we're gonna try to do this like this, there we go, to detect and characterize tumors and toxicity of treatment. And Caroline developed and leads institutional efforts to enable quantitative measurements for clinically impactful utilization and interpretation of data through a collaborative team science approach. Got it? You can also use that if you like.
Hopefully people can hear me. Good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Amber, I think you set me up really well here. We're going to have a little bit of an offline debate. So I'm going to present some provocative thoughts. I think that, Amber, you've really shown the promise of where we can go with AI in medicine. I'm going to start to talk about how building AI bridges to clinic takes more than a hammer. And we need to start to be thoughtful about how we're using the technology in the right appropriate setting, knowing that the setting is constantly ever changing. The types of data that's coming in is changing. The rules and regulations about who uses that data, the data governance pieces that Amber mentioned, is also changing. And so how do we actually make ourselves resilient to this? So I'm going to go back to I'm a clinician by traditional training. I've explored and expanded my horizon into the data world. But I'm going to start from where we started in medicine with Hippocrates. And so Hippocrates, the father of medicine, already started talking about data-driven medicine right from the very start. If you look at these quotes, science is the father of knowledge, but opinion breeds ignorance. So we really need to start thinking about our data. And he also focused on personalized. So although we use these buzzwords of data-driven, personalized medicine, it's been there right from the beginning. We fast forward to the father of the first modern medical training program, William Osler. He also resounded around the fact that medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. So we need to start thinking about what is that uncertainty? How do we bring that uncertainty and make it transparent to us, and be able to acknowledge that uncertainty and work with it so that we can actually build out algorithms that are meaningful and present that uncertainty so we can make sound decisions. He also reinforced this need for context. So context is really critical, that every patient you see is a lesson much more than in just the malady from which he suffers. So what are the other contextual pieces? As I see patients, when you ask them how they got there, they will start to tell you a story about perhaps they were riding down a truck on their local farm, and there are multiple farms farming the same sorts of things. What chemicals are on those farms? All those pieces, many clinicians will kind of overlook and say, well, I want to get to the medical part of your history, but perhaps we're missing that opportunity. So how do we start bringing that context in to really maximize what we can learn about each disease? So if this is where medicine has started, and we've really been thinking about data-driven medicine, we've been thinking about personalized medicine, we've been having this emphasis around context, why have we really struggled to enable a personalized data-driven strategy and approach for medicine? Where we started is through this practice of medicine. I liken the medical chart that we're charting in like the weather vane. It's a snapshot, you look at the patient, you can see what's happening there, you're examining them, you know which way the wind is turning. I would say that, as we start to think about evidence-based medicine, I would liken the Cochrane collaboration. It's not a poo-poo on the Cochrane collaboration. It's an immense amount of work, and it's a way to aggregate our evidence that we've published in a meaningful way. It is a powerful tool to look at big patterns. I liken it to the Farmer's Almanac. The Farmer's Almanac has been around for many, many years. It's great at predicting big weather patterns. We know, and it does it fairly reliably, remarkably so. And I would liken the Cochrane collaboration, when we're looking at big population statistics, it does a reasonable job. But that's not really what we're after in medicine when we have a patient sitting in front of us. We want to have this sort of live stream weather report that's saying, should I leave the city? I've learned about hurricanes as I moved to Houston from Canada. And so I went from snowstorms to hurricanes. But you watch that weather report to see whether you should be hunkering down or you should be leaving the city. And so we want warnings of how we need to react, how we need to adapt. And these are the types of data that we have streaming in. But we're not necessarily bringing that together in a semblance and a visualization where we can actually react in a meaningful way. And one of the biggest challenges that we have right now is tackling this foundational challenge around us, which is our data. So there is this lack of awareness, this AI chasm that Eric Topol had mentioned, between the scientific ability to build a sound algorithm that you publish in very high impact journals, and bring it actually into clinic, into practice to create an impact. And part of that chasm is an understanding of the nuances and uncertainties in the data, so coming back to the probabilities and uncertainties of what is in that medical chart. There is a ton of data in the medical chart. How much of that data truly is reliable with high precision, and how much of it has a large amount of uncertainty that you can't necessarily make sound decisions with that data. So there's that chasm on the data scientist side. On the clinician side, there's a chasm of probably that understanding, that real understanding of how these AI algorithms come to be. And starting to build that chasm and building this bridge is going to be a critical piece. And context is that critical piece. Context, as data scientists understand, as they get data in rows and columns and they're trying to make sense of it, understanding which columns can they actually combine. I was talking at dinner last night saying something like the number of hours of admission seems like, inpatient admission seems like a pretty simple thing for everyone to get, right? But there are 10, 20, 50 different ways to measure the number of hours of admission for that patient. And so if you're actually starting to combine columns of hours of admission from different institutions, from different practices, with different definitions, you may not be combining apples with apples, but apples with bananas or pineapples or something that's not even a fruit. And so how do we start to bring this context together to really make sense and make models that are going to be truly impactful and translatable into the real world? And the reality is that data generation in healthcare is messy and it's labor intensive, and we've all seen papers around physician burnout and requirements to click 1,000, death by 1,000 button clicks. So how do we actually start to get there? And we've started it in medicine with this sort of qualitative, unique, every experience is unique. You dictate a unique note that's like a story. You tell it, it's not structured. We're trying to move into implementing technology, and we need to bring structure. But by default, this transition of adding complexity to the technology really has this mandatory need to get over this hump. And I would say for the clinicians in the room and the clinical teams in the room, sometimes we do feel like assembly workers where they're like, can you click on this one extra button? We need to get these additional structured data elements. But if we don't get past this hump, and I think we're getting to the peak of this hump, we can't get past this hump. We can't get to the place that's really, really exciting, the part where we can automate, the part where we can quantitate. And so in order for us to get past this hump, we need to start to embrace the need to harmonize and structure our data across multiple hospitals, institutions, countries. And once we do that, we can start to automate. We have the technology available to us. Amber's shown great examples of ways the technology is there, but are we getting there in terms of true clinical impact? And we have all of these pieces that have been demonstrated very successfully in small groups, single institutions, but how do we actually do it in a way that impacts true healthcare globally? And what we're missing in many situations is the context around our data. Bit of a lag. And this really came to fruition and became transparent during the pandemic. So Andrew Ng published an article around the fact that we need to move away from big data to smart-sized data. And one of the things that really got highlighted is during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of sharing of data. There were thousands of images shared around COVID, hundreds of algorithms built around diagnosing COVID off of CTs as well as chest x-rays. The problem with it is most of them completely failed when they tried to deploy it in other institutions. And then MIT published a paper saying, actually, what we looked at when we looked at these public data sets, that metadata, that context that was overlooked by these data scientists that were building hundreds of algorithms trying to diagnose COVID, was the age of the patient. The patients who had normal lungs, non-COVID positive lung scans in that open source data set were pediatric. And the COVID-affected lungs were largely adult. So what the algorithms were learning were the difference between a pediatric lung and an adult lung as opposed to COVID and no COVID. Then you applied it in an emergency room with all adult patients who were getting COVID at the time, and it was not able to distinguish because they were all adult lungs. That context was so critical. And I published a paper at the end of December, it was December 2021, here's the reference, that cancer needs this robust metadata supply chain to realize the true power of AI. And it's because when you think about the nuances of a cancer patient, if you think about all their comorbidities, perhaps their geography, we talked about disparities, if we start to overlook that metadata, it becomes very difficult for us to decipher what is truly a biological difference that's resulting in an impact and response to treatment versus all of these other things that's causing noise. The additional pieces that are causing noise that I'm going to pivot to is in the technological world. So within this paper, I highlighted that observations need to be in context. And a great example that I've used is if you think about a single number like a heart rate, pretty simple data element, it's a single number. But if think about the context of how you would interpret that heart rate and think about what's getting fed in when we talk about big data coming from our smartwatches and things. If you have a heart rate of 120, that's the number that you get, single data point. How would you interpret that not knowing the context? Because if someone was running on a treadmill or on an elliptical, you could say, well, you're not running quite hard enough because you're not even in the aerobic zone of your heart rate. Someone's been lying in bed for 5 hours and they have a heart rate of 120, somebody better be calling 911 because something bad is happening. And so that context is so critical to interpreting that number. When you get hundreds of thousands of data points flowing in, then you may not necessarily appreciate that context with hundreds of thousands of data points coming in. And you're making models and building assumptions that may or may not really resonate with what will lead to clinical impact. Dynamic assessment of quality. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, that the quality does not necessarily have to be perfect. We can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. There are situations, Amber gave great examples of hypothesis generation, where you can have some noisy data. You're looking for big patterns you want to later validate. But if you're looking for an algorithm that you're going to run for a patient sitting in front of you, the precision in your measurements better be high quality, and you better be able to trust the data that you're putting in. Provenance linking insights to observations. This is a great statement in terms of thinking about what we are doing with our open source data sets. When the data comes from multiple institutions and we don't gather the appropriate metadata, let's say we're looking at images. We don't know what scanner, we don't know what software model they've used, we don't know what the imaging parameters may or may not have been, and not having enough detail, the contrast agent that was used, how it was injected, all of those details and the provenance and the details and the metadata that will help us interpret those observations need to be there for those open source data sets to truly be impactful and useful. And this only works if we can actually integrate it into a data governance model that works together. And really this comes down to the fact that the underlying glue is down in that metadata and the descriptors. And I would argue that imaging is a great beacon for personalized cancer treatment. And so I'm going to go a little bit further into imaging and early AI applications. I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly because Amber showed some great examples of how AI is showing promise in imaging. There's also computational approaches. This is one that I've published in scientific reports, looking at mechanistic-based modeling to actually predict response in glioblastoma. But there are many nuances to actually getting this right. And so I would actually argue back that we have not necessarily resolved the segmentation problem in imaging, partly because we don't necessarily have good definition of what the tumor margin is. So here's an example of context, creating the sum of the parts. So are you actually getting the whole person? So the solid red line is what the AI algorithm has marked as the person. It's missing her legs, so you've actually missed a part of that person. When it comes to a tumor, if you're missing part of a tumor, it's sort of a critical detail. Here's an example of what we see on a CT scan here, and when you zoom it up, you can see this tumor. And I would say if I took the 100 of you in this room to actually draw a line around where that whole tumor is, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. It's easy to point to a tumor and say that's a tumor. It's much more difficult to define, whereas I think most of us would know where the human starts and ends in this picture. And so this whole idea of actually getting to that ground truth, and we do have richer evidence. We have multimodal imaging, and we've learned in glioblastoma, we know that where the contrast stops leaking out is not necessarily the margin of the tumor. We know when we use amino acid PET, there's other areas that don't even look like tumor on the MRI that are clearly lighting up, and we still need to really build in that understanding around imaging and pathology moving forward so we can make meaningful biological assessments with the images. Here's another example from a bit of a delay. Here's another example in terms of the classroom and looking at chairs. So seeing the trees from the forest, if there's overlapping images, you can't quite get all of it. Labeling sheep, it's missed all of the other sheep. It's missed a bunch of images. And similarly, we can run into same problems in medical imaging. And seeing the trees from the forest, if you get a CT scan of someone like this and they've got a lung nodule, it's very different than patients' training images where they've trained an algorithm where they've got crystal clear lungs and they've got a tumor, and trying to apply an algorithm that's been trained on images like this on a patient with chest image like this is going to be a very different situation. So we really need to be thoughtful about how do we actually build these algorithms. And I'm going to end the talk by providing a little bit of a provocative statement around how generalizable should a model be. Finally, there is an impact of image quality. So this was in archive. This is more just popular images that people have used for classification problems and looking at image quality. They've used some common AI architectures, and they run this as they've slowly degraded the quality of the images. You can see the images are starting to get more degraded. And that you can see that the performance starts to degrade as the image quality degrades. We found very similar patterns in medical imaging. There should be no surprises there. And I would argue that one of the things, the other hat that I wear is I co-chair the neuro-oncology neuroimaging subcommittee within the Alliance for Clinical Trials. We get images from multiple NCTN centers, and I would say that even on an MRI, of the brain, a standard MRI brain, anatomic images, you're getting slice thicknesses anywhere from 0.7 millimeters all the way to 5 millimeter scans. If you're looking for a brain metastasis that's 1 millimeter size, and you're using 5 millimeter scan MRIs, you're guaranteed to potentially miss some of these tumors. And so we've actually worked as a neuro-oncology community to build out these consensus statements around how we should be acquiring these images. So just because you have the images, it may not be the images that you need. And so how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? Which images should you actually be eliminating because you may not be able to use that for training? Which images are not appropriate for applying an algorithm because your image quality, the way that you've acquired your images, your image quality is so poor that that algorithm is more than likely to fail. This starts to translate into the Quantitative Imaging Biomarker Alliance that I vice chair. This is really starting to build out that thinking of consistent image acquisition, consistent processing. How do we get to the precision in our measurement? And we've just started to roll out 2 campaigns, #QI for AI. So how can quantitative imaging help accelerate AI so that thinking around consistent image acquisition, getting to that quantitative measurement, how does that accelerate AI? Can we actually train models faster because the data quality is better? And similarly, hashtag AI for QI. How can we use AI to improve or harmonize and recalibrate our images despite the variability in our image acquisition? And so we're really hoping to partner with multiple groups within this effort. And so if you're interested, please let me know. So as I had alluded to, that we need to match the data and the quality of the data for the intended use. So let's really go back to ask ourselves, what are we trying to answer? What is that question we're trying to answer? And I liken it to the analogy of water. There's a certain purity of water that most of us are willing to drink, that depending on how much you love your plants, you may be able to get slightly lower quality water to water the plants that you're going to eat with the plants that you're actually going to turn to food. And then, depending on how much you love your car, you might be willing to take slightly less pure water to wash your car, and everything else kind of goes down the toilet. And so you're not drinking out of the toilet, unless maybe some of your pet dogs may, but most of us would not drink the water out of the toilet. Similarly, I don't think that we need to aspire to the purity of this water quality as our data quality for every single exercise that we need. So we can't paralyze ourselves trying to get to perfect data, but how do we actually find the right quality data and match it to the activity that we're going to do? And in an ideal setting, you really want to start to think about, what is that question you're trying to answer? How are you going to use this tool? Is it a single patient that you're trying to make an individual personalized decision on? Are you looking at population statistics, looking for patterns? Are you generating hypotheses? And right now, we're really kind of focusing on swinging the pendulum one way or another, but I think we really need to be thoughtful about applying the right quality data for the right intentions. The second piece is building the meaningful training and validation sets. And this goes back to that quality, but there are other aspects beyond quality. Some of these other contextual pieces that really matter. The cohort, the age, as I noted, the COVID example, race and ethnicity and the biases, the societal biases that we talk about. But we've also talked about the other thing that is overlooked in terms of the biases that we were talking about last night is the practice biases. There's different regions that will make different decisions. There are different policies in different institutions. So how do you account for those clinical biases, the decision-making biases that the physicians are implementing outside of the societal biases? And how does that feed into your algorithm? And similarly, as hospitals think about deploying models, if those models were based on practices that are very different from theirs, that might be why it's not working, because they're treating their patients very differently. And so how do we actually start to narrow that gap in understanding and asking the appropriate piece? The geographic pieces, I mentioned sort of driving down a farm and looking at environmental factors, and the other comorbidities that are often not necessarily captured in detail when it gets to large open source data sets. We can start to think about all of these. The measurement error bias, scanner, protocol, patient cooperation, can we look at motion, et cetera. And then the availability. Sometimes the availability could actually be tied to the geography. People can't get to their center that they need to get their tests at. Insurance status, they may have gaps in insurance and they've missed appointments, as well as the age. And we've talked about things like staging a patient and having 4-month delays before they start treatment. If they have an aggressive cancer, are they really stage 2 at the time that they start treatment? Perhaps not, and perhaps that is influencing what our Kaplan-Meier curves look like for a stage 2 patient. So how do we start to narrow that gap and make that appreciation? And finally, in terms of the model performance, so considerations of when we want to define success. The holistic generalizable model may not be the answer, and that's what most groups have started to do at the beginning. I think people are starting to realize that's not necessarily the right approach. I would argue that you're not going to take your F1 racing car on this terrain, and there's a time and place for a very small car, and other times and places when you have kids have a minivan. And so you may not want to drive a minivan when you're in Europe, but it depends on the size of your family. So there is a time and place for each of these vehicles, and a time and place with the type of fuel that each of these vehicles also take. And so if you think about those pieces, that's kind of the nuanced analogy that I like to say. is that we need to think about the differences, opinions in practice, making sure that you're picking the right model for the right setting. Differences in the data. Is your institution ready for the type of model that you're considering bringing in? Because maybe you're not collecting all of the data in the right way. And there are some interesting industry partners that have started to pivot the way that they're approaching their conversations with hospitals, saying, this is the type of data you need to run our model. And are you ready? And they're willing to walk away and say, we'll come back in 2 to 3 months when you, or whatever time frame you need to get yourself ready to actually make our model successful, not trying to force fit that model into that setting. And it's been very interesting conversations around the fact that they find that is a healthier conversation than trying to get the model into each of the hospitals and just, you know, ramping up volumes of institutions that they've actually engaged. So in summary, there are many promising potential uses of AI in medicine. I think this is a very exciting time. But in order for us to generate AI models that will translate into clinical impact, we need to start building those bridges. And we're going to get you out of that the crevasse that you're falling into. But we really need to start to think about and have this conversation around what is that clear goal or question that will benefit from AI. Not everything will benefit from AI. There are things that we may not need to use AI for at all. So what is that clear goal? And based on that clear goal, what is that definition of success? And what is that intended use, that intended environment that we're planning to use this AI model? And that'll help us define the appropriate patient population, the type of data, the quality of data that we're requiring, and it'll drive the approach to that model development and the requirements for both the training and testing data. And finally, working across these interdisciplinary teams, I've already learned that everyone speaks very different languages, so we need to start to understand each other, but I'm hoping that this will also help us grow awareness around the current challenges of our data. I've shared some of them with you today. There are many more examples that I can share with you around the current challenges of data generation in healthcare and starting to use technology to address those challenges. So how do we use AI for AI? So that pre-preparation step of all the data that's coming in, the assumptions that are made in that pre-preparation step before you're actually starting to build the model really starts to be a place where you start to introduce biases in the model, assumptions that are made. And so that's kind of where I think that the stronger effort needs to be put in, where we have largely focused on the downstream building of the models, which is the exciting fun part. But if we don't get the right pieces moving in, it's the garbage in, garbage out. And so how do we actually start tackling these necessary context and consistency conversations around our data? So I'll end there and open up for questions. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we found to enrich context, because physicians don't have time to take the patient histories, as you pointed out, is rather than history and rather than survey, we actually have patients talk to a healthcare professional, not a physician,
Mm-hmm.
and give a narrative of their history. Because there are a lot of things that the patient experiences that never really work. And they would never take to a clinician. And then we use natural language processing to extract those patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And it serves two purposes. It shows you a lot of the factors before the patient would show up with clinical symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
But it also gives the patient the sense that you're listening to them, which they don't usually have. So it's an adjunct, I think, to what you're talking about.
Yes, I totally agree. And there is technology that's emerging in terms of conversational AI and breaking down that conversation. And whether we capture all of that data in some form, in raw form, in the charts that we can go back and interrogate those questions, I think is going to be something that everyone is starting to look into. The other piece around this you mentioned the sequencing of the presentation of symptoms relative to the treatment. When we look at our medical chart today, and I'm not going to go too far into the EHR story, but when we look in the medical chart today, that timeline is not so easily generated. And so how do we actually create that visual timeline so we can see when did that side effect appear? Was it after they received both of these treatments? What sequence was that treatment in? And so then we can start to actually look at patterns across patients. But that's not so readily available to us today with the way that data is visualized. So I totally agree.
So I'm a data guy. This is really awesome, but I'm a guy who's wired lots of cancer knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are at Dick College. What would you say, maybe it's better for a panel discussion, what kind of training should we give some data scientists or all data scientists in order not to forget something so obvious as pediatric versus adult contrast? Because what I've heard is horror stories about people just taking the data, throwing it into their model, and they say we got a result.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what do you think about training for, cross training for?
Yeah, I really think that there needs to be that bidirectional communication. So I think one of the things is that I think on the clinical side, there probably isn't necessarily a realization of the amount of assumptions that you make as you work with the data on the data science side. And on the data science side, these nuanced, I mean, everyone thinks modern medicine has data we talk about the volume of data that's coming in, but we don't necessarily talk about the noise that's coming in with all of that data and the inconsistencies that we see across the patient chart. If we follow through, there's pieces of that history that change over time because it's being corrected, but it's not corrected retrospectively. And so depending on what time frame you've pulled your data, you may or may not have the right data points. And so that bidirectional communication and understanding of the challenges on both sides is incredibly important. And I think the other piece is that as we work through these data projects, having that partnership happen much before, I think right now it almost happens transactionally. The clinicians have got an idea, they've got their data set, and they throw it over to you and like, good luck with that. And that's probably not the best way to do it. We probably need to shape that question up front together and reform that question. At MD Anderson, we've kind of changed the way we've had that conversation now. So we've created what we call a data office. And the first sets of conversations is not about, I need my 100 data elements sent over to me. It's, what is that question you're trying to answer? Let us find the right right source and data for you with the appropriate quality and the appropriate metadata to come along. And that forces that conversation around what is the age of the patient. So having that dialogue is really, really important.
Hey, Dr. Chung, thank you. Quick question. The example you gave about the age and the AI, latching onto the age was very illustrious. So I'm wondering about federated learning and how this can overall address some of these challenges. Building a data set, takes a long time, inevitably, in any field. In medical imaging certainly takes a while. So, presumably this missing field, the age that was not included, was aggregated somewhere, and implicitly it would take a long time to go and ask everybody else to give that in a second round of data pool, right? So if we had a federated architecture and the data was already staying at the end points, right, would it be easier to go back and update and kind of have more of a living data set?
Yeah, I mean, I think that federated learning is opening our eyes up. As people have their models travel around, they start to see where things are kind of falling off the rails and where things need to be tweaked. I think the one caution that I would say as we think about federated learning, it's not always the model that's wrong. It's not necessarily retraining the model, but making sure that the definition of the input data element that people think they're putting in is truly what was intended in the model. And so again, that bidirectional communication needs to happen. I think everyone kind of thinks about these models as sort of plug and play situations, and then they blame the model when it doesn't work. And I would say that might not be the model at all. How do we find the appropriate quality of is your data, like I said, those companies are starting to learn, having that conversation of, are you ready to actually even receive this model? And do you have promise to actually make this work? And finding that right model fit. So we may, over time, build models that are intended for messy data. We want to make the technology available to everyone. Not everyone has the highest quality technology to acquire the best quality images, but how do we build the appropriate models that are robust to noisier, poorer quality images, accepting the fact that that's part of reality at this point, and then creating that supply and demand for higher quality data over time, because we're seeing the nuanced differences in outcome, in the performance of these models and the ability to use technology.
Thank you.
Hi, it seems to me from your talk and also Amber's talk, lots of images of bridges and
yes.
huge, huge gaps below the bridges. So and also based on some of the questions, so where are we? Are we ready yet for training? I mean, is this beginning to appear, for example, in medical school curricula? Because it seems like the whole game here is having a clear, standardized, structured data set going in. As you said, garbage in, garbage out.
I think that there is an inkling that it's going in that direction. There have been more bioengineering/medicine training programs, started over the last 5 years than ever before. So I think, but those are small cohorts of people. To your point, how do we actually implement this as part of medical training? I think it's a necessity for perhaps not to everyone to be coding in Python by the end of it. And I think that's the thing, is I think the coding in Python piece is almost the easier part to teach. The nuances of what does that mean for the data and how do you actually apply the models, that's the conversation that needs to happen, that is harder to teach. And so I think that how do we actually implement that into our training? It's a necessary piece, because it's going to be around us whether you want to keep your eyes closed or not. It's going to be there around you in practice.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My question was on the point that you raised on the AI chasm, sometimes referred to as mismatch. And I'm wondering, regarding the conversation around that mismatch AI chasm, especially as it pertains to monitoring models, as our data increases, our data points increase, and we have more to feed into the models, as well as the technologies improve. So what's the conversation in that space?
Yeah, so in terms of the model management and the ML ops side of things, there's a lot of technology platforms that will monitor the performance of the model. The harder part is defining your threshold as a practicing group of what is that appropriate threshold, and working with those who have developed the model to make sure that it's performing at a level. The second piece around that is that each of these model performance thresholds is also, we have to remember that it's integrated into an overall clinical workflow, ideally. That's the true integrated concept of using AI as a tool. And that's where I think we are struggling to find the right balance of that human-machine hybrid interaction of how do we avoid complete complacency because of what the model is perhaps doing for you, and having physicians not, or clinicians not necessarily overlook and make sure that it is working, versus having overburdening people with too many false positives that you're just getting burned out and you're walking away. And so how do you find that right balance of performance as well as integrating that into your clinical workflow, so that there's a healthy balance of healthy cynicism and making sure that you're double checking and using it as a tool as opposed to a crystal ball that's going to do everything for you.
I appreciate your comments about the data quality and especially the context. A lot of what you're describing sounds like study design to me. Yeah, I think that's the part that's often completely ignored. So we talk data quality, which is a much different thing than study design. So what do you think about bringing someone like an epidemiologist into the mix of where you need bridges, and would that help some of these problems that you've been thinking through?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it is true that I think we need to expand what we're considering as the interdisciplinary group. The other specialty that I've started to engage with is human anthropology, because that interaction of what the models are doing and how AI and technology are influencing our behavior is something that we need to start to consider as we build out more and more of these tools for clinical applications. So I totally agree. I think bringing additional perspectives in would be very helpful. And I agree with you that it is the study design, question design problem. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not sure if this needs to get plugged back.
Great, thanks so much, Caroline. So let me introduce Fred Streets. He's the Senior Advisor at the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the CDC, the Chief Computational Scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. He is also serving as a member of the National AI Research Task Force. Prior to this, he held a number of leadership roles at Lawrence Livermore within the Department of Energy, and including the inaugural director of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab High Performance Computing Innovation Center. And he's also the senior advisor in the AI Intelligence Technology Office, which he helped create at the Department of Energy. Fred, are you ready?
Oh, except for the mic. Almost ready.
Almost ready. So we do have people listening online, so when you're asking questions, make sure you get to a microphone so they can hear as well.
Okay, I think that's on. Is that on?
Can you hear? I think you're on.
Is that, okay.
No.
Okay. Now it's on. All right. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I know this has been a long time coming, setting up the Hood Symposium, so it's a pleasure to finally be here, and what a great set of talks ahead of me. I'm gonna go in a very different direction, because I'm gonna start talking about a very specific application of AI with high performance computing. Why does it always do that the wrong way? Where's the swap display? There we go. All right. And this is part of the program that Doug Loy mentioned at the very beginning, which is the JDAX for C program. It's a collaboration between the NCI and the DOE. I hope, if I have enough time, and I'm worried that I'm going to take us, the previous two speakers managed to keep us on schedule. I'm afraid I may ruin that, but we'll see. I hope I have some time, because I'd like to make some comments on some of the topics that were brought up, which are not actually in my talk, but nevertheless. Okay, there we go. So I'm really going to talk about an application of artificial intelligence in conjunction with high performance computing, and this is really what we envisioned when we created the partnership between the NCI and the DOE. And the reason I think this is really important is because each one of these tools, whether you're talking about experiment or traditional simulation or the application of machine learning, bring a different viewpoint into the problems you're trying to solve. And the way I look at this is, and I should a word of warning up front. So I'm a physicist by training. So I have pretended to be a lot of things in my career: a cardiologist, an oncologist, radiation hydrodynamicist, all sorts of things. But none of that is actually my training. I actually began my training, which is hard to believe now, although these many years ago, as an experimental experimental materials scientist. I worked in a high vacuum lab. We did sputter deposition. I did all. I'm perfectly comfortable in a world where there are a lot of sensors and things, and you have to leak test equipment, and it doesn't work. What is an experiment? An experiment really is a way that we query nature. We pose a question of nature, and then we design an experiment in order to get an answer back. And one can argue whether we get the right answer or whether we interpret it correctly and all that, but that's just science. But experiment is how we query nature. So in that context, simulation is really how we query our understanding. We build a model, and then we do simulation, and that's how we explore our understanding of that, of nature. It's not an experiment, but I mean, it's not an experiment of nature. It's an sort of an experiment of what we think of nature. Machine learning is actually none of those. I mean, so application of artificial intelligence now is not really doing the same thing. Independent of all of that, given a set of data, whether you have the data directly from experiment or data from simulation, you can now pose questions of the data. And that's what we get out of machine learning. And it's agnostic to where you got the data or what your assumptions were going in. So taken together, the three things allow you to do what I call cognitive computing, and that's what we're going to talk about is the application of all these things sort of together. But it lets you explore regions of science where we don't have hard equations. And like I said, my bias as a physicist, you know, we have Schrödinger's equation, we have Newton's equations, you can write equations down for stuff. As I've started working with biologists over the last decade or so, I've come to appreciate that there are very few equations in biology. Biology is largely an observational science. We're trying to get to where it's more predictive. That doesn't necessarily mean getting better equations. It may mean using a little more machine learning, but it lets us explore stuff for which there really is no set of equations. So Doug had to leave, unfortunately. I kidded him that, you know, apparently he was going to have to drive all the way to New York just to avoid hearing me give yet another talk on the program. But nevertheless, so, you know, Doug, who was then, as he is now, the acting director of the NCI, lo these many years ago, that was about 7-8 years ago, along with Secretary Ernie Moniz, decided that this scheme, this win-win-win scheme that he described, which is applying the expertise in modeling and high-performance computing that's available inside the Department of Energy with the medical background, the cancer expertise that exists in the NCI, is going to benefit both institutions. And you can barely read this here, but in our cute little logo, built into the logo is the comment that computing drives cancer advances and cancer drives computing advances. And I will give you examples of sort of both of those as we go forward. So we created these three projects. I won't go into great detail. He sort of described them. Each one had a lead inside the DOE and a lead inside the NCI. First one looking at preclinical model development, basically focused on the simple fact that someone quipped to me early in my pseudo-oncology career was that we have solved cancer many times in a Petri dish. It turns out it's really hard to solve in a human, but we can do it in a Petri dish. So why is that? And so this project was looking at the wealth of data on cancer and pharmaceutical intervention measures done on cell lines, and trying to see, can we use machine learning to bridge the gap about why does it work in a cell line but it does not work when you're actually in a human? What are we missing? There's the project that I lead along with my partner, Dwight Nisley from Frederick, who's actually in the audience, and he'll jump up and throw something at me if I say something egregiously incorrect. But he usually gives me enough rope that I can hang myself, so that's fine. I'll get to that. This is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. And then the third project was, as Doug mentioned, was the precision surveillance associated with the SEER program, and that was led by Gina Tarasi, who's here in the audience. And I won't say anything to embarrass her, and Lynn at NCI. So that was actually 6 years ago. It's hard to believe, but that was 6 years ago. It was a 5-year set of projects. We never got past the Pilot 1, Pilot 2, and Pilot 3 nomenclature, which is how they were originally designed back on a drawing board. Is there a very long lag, or is it not listen? There we go. So now we're in phase 2 of these projects, which just kicked off. We just are finishing our first year of what is the next piece of these projects. And now, with 5 years of experience, we were able to put actual names together for the projects. So the project led out of Argonne is now called the Improve Project. The project I lead with Dwight is called the Admiral Project, and the project that Gina and Lynn lead is now called the Mosaic Project. And they all do slightly different things. So Rick and Ryan's project, and Ryan is in the audience here, is stepped beyond looking at the cell line issue to focus on what was a real failure mode that had come up during the application of the execution of the first project, which was a rank inability to really evaluate machine learning models. And so the Improve project is really looking at building methodologies to formally evaluate a machine learning methodology, so you could say, well, this one's a correct or appropriate one, and this one's not a correct or an appropriate one, and how do you actually do that in a formal way? I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we're going with the Admiral Project and why that's, I think, a really exciting extension to what was done with Pilot 2. And the Mosaic Project is really extending what was done with SEER surveillance into multiple different domains, including actually doing population modeling, which was one of the original promises of Pilot 3. So, oops. Now, see, it listens when it wants to, and it doesn't listen when it doesn't want to. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about RAS cancer biology, because that's the project that Pilot 2 and now Admiral is focused on. And I think that there are experts here in the audience, but you aren't all experts, and I certainly wasn't, so I'll give you just a very quick overview of what RAS does. So RAS is this protein that sits on a membrane. It's an integral part of the cell mitosis pathway. So this is how cells process the signal that says now it's time to grow. So you want to grow a new cell. It's typically a triggered phenomenon in the sense that it sits quiescent most of the time. And then under certain circumstances it gets a signal that says it's time to send the signal to grow. And then a whole bunch of stuff happens in classic biology fashion. So it can't just say that. It has to first recruit a RAF kinase out of the cytoplasm, and then that does a whole bunch of stuff at the interface. It binds now with another one. There's a dimerization that happens, and then you grab this next guy, and then that goes through, and eventually at the very end of this, it goes into the nucleus and says divide. So there's a whole pathway there, and there's a physicist's description of biology for you. The problem is that this, I said, is a triggered phenomenon, and there is an oncogenic mutation to this protein where it no longer is triggered. It winds up getting stuck in the on position. So once it says tells the cell to divide and grow, it'll say that again as fast as it can, and it just says grow, 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 grow. And these are the hyper-aggressive cancers that we know. So 93% of all pancreatic cancer is actually this mutation in a RAS protein. And that's essentially a death sentence. 42%, not all pancreatic cancer, because 7%, if you're really lucky, is this other cancer, and that one can actually be treated. But 93% is this. 42% of colorectal, a third of lung cancers. So this is about 1 million deaths a year associated with this mutation of this protein, and there are no effective inhibitors currently. There are some that are being just now, recently, in the last couple of years, that are being attempted. So what do we know? What we know is that RAS has to exist on a membrane, and I can go into a little more detail about that, but this whole thing doesn't work just in solution, so the membrane's important. And that the first thing it has to do is it has to grab this RAF kinase, and then all sorts of conformation changes have to occur. Those are the things we know sort of in the beginning. So here's a quicker look at the whole, well, a bigger look at the whole thing. It's actually quite complicated, as I was dismayed to find out. So here again is this RAS. RAF kinase, which plays a critical role, has 3 pieces actually. It has something called the CRD, which is the cysteine-rich domain. Has something called the RBD, which is the RAS binding domain. It's so named because when all things happen, the RAS binding domain binds to RAS. But in order to get there, it starts out like all bound up and then held together with a 14-3-3 protein, which is called a chaperone protein. And that makes sense because it's auto-inhibited, so it's auto-inhibited because it has a chaperone. But eventually it's going to get to where it binds with RAS, and it's going to lose one of the chaperones, and now it's less inhibited. And eventually it's going to dimerize with RAF. We presume there's some close proximity now of a second RAS. And this entire complex, oops, I could be doing this, except it doesn't listen to me. There. Maybe if I just stand here. So finally you get to this the release of autoinhibition, and you start building the signaling platform after you activate. And there's a whole bunch of conformational change that has to occur. And the reason this is important is, well, not only because this is how it actually happens, but because it's along these steps that we believe that you can impact the process and perhaps develop a therapeutic. As my crude understanding of how many drugs are developed is that you try to figure out what protein is doing what you didn't want it to do, and then you try to find a small molecule that you can wedge in some very inopportune spot in the protein and make it stop what it was trying to do. So there, that's medicine for you. It turns out that the RAS protein is very difficult to wedge something in. It's a very compact protein. It's been described as a bowling ball on a string. So instead of trying to actually put something into the RAS protein itself, this is a very complicated process. It's a process with a lot of edges on it, and you might be able to impact the process. However, to do that, we need to understand the process. And that is the point of Pilot 2, was to look at this very initial state of the process. So RAS on a membrane, and then RAS trying to recruit RAF. And what is the importance of the membrane? So what we set out doing then, and I started this project with Dwight, like I said, several years ago, and I'm a computational physicist, so I do, protein, molecular modeling and molecular dynamics and things like that. It seemed to me that what I have here is a problem of scale. We have, and here's another picture of the same thing. We have RAS stuck on a membrane. We want the membrane to evolve on a membrane timescale, which is long. It's milliseconds of time. It's microns of material. And we want all that to evolve on that time frame. But the problem is that all the stuff that happens in between, all the interfaces, here's the RBD binding RAS, that interface, that's not a microsecond problem. That's really like that's not a millisecond problem. That's a microsecond problem on nanometers of material. And we know how to do that. That's called molecular dynamics, and we can sort of evaluate that. But we need to make that connect now back to this other scale. So we needed an inherently multi-scale approach to this, where we're going to take the membrane and we're going to use that, model that with a continuum method, which is appropriate for that time and length scale. And then we're going to decorate that with information we're going to get at the molecular scale, because that's the appropriate model at the fine scale. And how are we going to connect the two? Okay, so the issue here is creating a workflow that's going to connect a macroscopic model of a lipid membrane with RAS proteins moving around on it with a fully atomistic simulation of the membrane with RAS protein on it. And we're going to do this by first building a continuum model with a bunch of input, and the input's going to include all the experimental data we can get our hands on, and this is, we work very closely with the folks at Frederick who have some exquisite experimental capability there. And we're going to augment that by doing a bunch of fine-scale simulations to build the information we need in order to construct this macroscopic model. Then we're going to use machine learning to answer the question of, out of that macroscopic model of continuum material, we can't afford to look at all of that at fine scale. If we could, I wouldn't do this to begin with. I would just done the fine scale model, right? But we can't afford to do that. So, computationally, even with the largest computers on Earth. And we did use the largest computer on Earth to do this. So we have to pick and choose, and what we're going to use is machine learning to help us pick and choose what part of the macroscopic model is the most profitable now to do a microscopic set of analysis on. And then that information can get fed back, because I remember at the very beginning we used a bunch of microscopic models to build the macro model. We're going to do a bunch of analysis on a bunch of other microscopic models, so we can now feed that information back in, and we can do that in a closed loop. Of course, the analysis will also lead to new experiments, which also give you information into the model. So this centerpiece of taking a macro model, running it using machine learning, building macro models, doing analysis, and feeding it back in, we can do that in a closed loop on a computer. We can take a human out of that loop. That can be done completely automatically. And we call this piece MUMI, which is the multi-scale machine-learned modeling infrastructure. So let's show you how it works. So here's MUMI step by step. So step one, we're running this macroscopic model. So this is a square micron of material with 300 RAS proteins moving around on it. This is a continuum model. So first we have to pick out what regions of interest we have. So we're going to do this by building an autoencoder and creating a latent space of that entire system, looking at all the compositions and all the regions and all the conformations of RAS, and all that gets folded in. It's a very high dimensional space, but we're going to use an autoencoder to reduce that to, I think at the end of the day it was 15 dimensions. So now we're going to ask the question, for any patch in the macro model, we could put it into the latent space, because that's what the encoder does. It maps one to the other. So here, let's say these 6 spaces, and they map here, 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 here to the gray dots. And what you notice is that 3 of them, the yellow dots, are sort of away from everybody else, and 3 of them, the red dots, are sort of close to things that you've already seen before. So the other dots are simulations you've already run. So then the trick then is to take these these 3 special dots, because they're exploring a place of a region of latent space that you hadn't actually seen before, and actually now do a full-scale simulation on that. And I'll talk a little bit more about this similarity selection process as we go on. So now, having identified a region, so all I have are compositions. So I have this little patch of material, and I know that my membrane has now 5% a PIP2 or 2% PIP2 and 30% cholesterol and all the other lipids that are in the membrane. I know what all the concentrations are, and I'm told that the RAS out of that, because this is what these other parameters come back, is in this particular conformational state. But that's a far cry from actually doing a molecular dynamics simulation. Now I have to build it, right? I have to put what does it mean to have 5% PIP2? Well, I need to put X number of finite PIP2 particles in the overall membrane. So you do all this. You go through a process where you randomly associate, at least at the correct composition, the entire lipid membrane. And then you can actually run a simulation that actually has your particles on it. And you can now extract other information, including things like radial distribution functions and so on and so forth that are going to be used. So this gives you feedback on the simulations that you ran. But the ones that you didn't run, you still keep track of, because that's how you're going to do your weighting at the end of the day. You want to keep all your statistics right, because the whole point of this similarity sampling is that it's going to allow us to explore further out on tails. But we don't want to kid ourselves that we're not out on a tail, right? We want to keep track of what the averages are. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about computing. And I realize that this is probably the furthest for many of you here in the audience, but for me, this is my daily life. So indulge me for a moment, because I did say at the very beginning that we were going to use cancer to drive computing as well as computing to drive cancer. So this is part of the cancer to drive computing piece. To build that workflow that I just described and have that all happen automatically with no human in the loop on one of the world's largest computers took an enormous amount of effort by a lot of people who knew nothing about biology. And it actually changed the way IBM in this case, which was the manufacturer of the machine that we were using, how they thought about the use of computers going forward in terms of the kinds of workflows that you need to be able to enable on a computer of that size. So I can honestly say that the project did have cancer drive the development of computing. But here's what the node on the Sierra supercomputer that was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab looks like. Each node has 2 IBM Power 9 CPUs, which have a whole bunch of chips on them. What is that, 22, I believe, cores. And each one of them also has 2 NVIDIA processors. Now, it turns out that may look like there's a lot of stuff up here, but these are actually very weak. Almost all of the floating point operations you can do are down here. So this is where you want to spend most of your time. And that's, in fact, exactly what we did. So this is how we broke the machine up. We're going to do our coarse-grained Martini simulations, which are the molecular simulations I talked about, all on the NVIDIA cores, taking one of the CPU cores out of the node just to help manage it. That's going to leave the rest of these relatively weak cores to do other things that are not as demanding. So we're going to take a fraction of them and do that for the analysis of these. That's going on the fly. And another piece are either going to be doing setup, because there's that whole process where you have to take the concentrations and turn it into a simulation. That takes a lot of work. Or you're actually running the macro model. So this is one node. The machine is actually 4,000 nodes. Our typical run was actually a half of the machine, so using a little over 2,000 nodes. And this is what it looked like. All of the GPUs were utilized to do this GPU calculation, along with do the coarse grain calculation, along with one node. Whole bunch was done using CG analysis. There's a fraction doing the macro model, fraction doing setup. And these little stripes in here, there was one entire node that was taken to run the actual workflow itself. Because somebody has to be controlling all of this. At the end of the day, this enabled us to look at this square micron of material, like I said, for 152 milliseconds, which is getting to be a pretty responsible period of time for a biology simulation, generating 2.2 million patches of information. We can't do 2.2 million fine-grained simulations. However, we did pick 116,000 simulations. 116,000 simulations were done in the course of this that were all linked without me having to go back and do them. They happened so that's 200 milliseconds of aggregated fine scale time along with about 10 trillion molecular dynamic steps. So the numbers are staggering, but what does that actually give us? Why would we do that? The thing is that these are all correlated. it's not just, you know, you went to Amazon Web Service and asked, you know, with a very large checkbook and just ran 100,000 simulations. They weren't 100,000 random simulations. There were 100,000 very correlated simulations. How correlated? Well, this is what I mean by that. So here, let's look at just this one particular lipid, PAP-C, out of the simulation. So to start with, our nominal concentration is, I think, a little over, it's like 7.5% or so. I forget the exact number, but it's that red line. After you've let the system evolve for a fairly lengthy period of time, hundreds and hundreds of simulations, you wind up with this orange, with this like lighter orange curve. And you see that not surprisingly, there are now patches in the simulation that are well below the average and patches that are well above the average. But despite the fact that that was a pretty long period of time, if you keep going, it doesn't actually conclude in some sense. It doesn't reach equilibrium until many, many thousand, 87,000 frames later, you get the blue curve. And you see now that there are regions of your membrane that, despite the fact that you have like a 7% average composition, there are regions that essentially you don't have any. PAP-C is not in the region at all. And there are other regions that have like 3 times the nominal average. And the important part of that, because if I just told you that, gave you that curve, you'd say, all right, so I can do simulations that vary from 0 to 30%. That's not a problem. What you don't know is what all the other lipids were doing as a result. But we do. Because the patch that had 3 times as much PAP-C has exactly the right amount of everybody else to support PAP-C being 3 times as much. And the way we got there mattered. And you can't get there by accident. So what does that do for us? Well, here's one of the things that we learned, is that there are membrane compositions that support the aggregation of RAS, and there are membrane compositions that don't support the aggregation of RAS. So looking at what we call our average RAS composition membrane, ARC, so this is the as-built, this is using all the nominal percentages that look something like this for the 8 lipids that were present in our membrane. The LRC, or low RAS composition, is just a relatively modest change. It's a higher amount of cholesterol, higher amount of PAP-C, a little bit of lower of everybody else. But when we went back to the experimentalists and said, well, this is what the model predicts now, is that these subtle, sometimes not so subtle changes in composition out of these 8 lipids in a specific membrane will actually, you know, when they prevent, but it sort of mitigates the aggregation of RAS. And conversely, if you do this other concentration, same 8 lipids, just twiddle the concentrations a little bit, you're going to get a membrane that actually supports the aggregation of RAS. And they went out and did surface plasmon resonance, building exactly those membranes and doing exactly the experiment, and found out that that is in fact exactly correct. The LRC seems to not like RAS as much compared to the average, and the HRC does appear to like RAS. So that was a prediction that came out of the simulations that we had done that demonstrate the importance of the correlation between all the lipids in how RAS behaves. Okay, so that was actually, everything I just talked about was 2 scales in the sense that I had a continuum model and a molecular model that was based on Martini, for those of you who are familiar with this, so a coarse grain model. But we wanted to be able to go down completely to atomistics, fully atomistic calculation. So that's actually a 3rd scale. And I won't go into this in great detail because this is already a complicated slide, but so everything I showed you before was this loop, and we introduced this loop. So now we're going to do the same thing out of these series of coarse-grained protein molecular simulations. We're going to also do a slightly different machine-learned novelty selection mechanism to decide which one of these handful do we actually want to do at fully atomistic resolution, and that's now to give us information that will inform the coarse grain model, because the coarse grain model is itself a hack, right? I mean, it's an aggregation of atoms to create a coarse grain bead that then has approximate forces attached to it, and there are all sorts of constraints you have to apply to make it actually work. Those constraints are fictitious in a sense because you've averaged in a funny way. So this is a way of going back and informing us what are the better ways to do those constraints, and we can do that again completely on the fly, no human in the loop. So we also made some improvements to the machine, this self-selection process. It turns out that one of the things you don't want to do, so for instance, so RAS is relatively rotationally symmetric, so this wasn't such a big deal in the first set of simulations. But for these second set of simulations where we're going fully diatomistic, we also, I didn't mention this, but we also included RAF in the simulation because that's that kinase that comes in, and we wanted to see how that was beginning to get connected to RAS. But now when you look on the membrane, the orientation matters. You can take something that looks otherwise identical, it's not no longer spherically symmetric, it's sort of like an oblong. And so it shouldn't matter that all you've done is spin it around by 180 degrees, but that means machine learning has to learn that. It has to learn that the identical conformation but only spun around is the same thing. That took actually a surprising amount of effort, but nevertheless we were able to do that, and that's what this demonstrates. So this is looking at the separation in latent space, and you can see that for systems that are simply rotated by a pi rotation or horizontal flip, they wind up all with very, very small differences. So in this latent space, things that are nothing different but a rotation wind up in the same spot, which is what we'd hope, but you have to sort of enforce that. Also, we were able to show that we actually captured some of the information we want. So this is a latent space, remember, it's an artificial representation of the data, but looking at some of the parameters of interest, like for instance, radial distribution functions, which is some of the input parameters we would use, looking at differences in radial distribution functions and comparing them to differences in latent space, we got a very nice correlation so that we can actually say with some confidence that the latent space is capturing some of the physical differences. And finally, we were able to separate out very cleanly things like whether you have a RAS, whether you have RAS and RAF, and that was all very important because everything I talked about up to now has been pilot 2, which I said was looking at just RAS on the membrane and RAS with RAF just joining it. But as I pointed out earlier, there's this whole other thing, and this is now the focus of the Admiral Project. And one of the things that came out of pilot 2 was the understanding that we want to be able to get to here, but this involves just a large amount of motion, as I sort of described earlier. Things have to unfold. There's a fair amount of motion on the membrane. Dimerization has to happen. These things are very difficult to capture in a molecular model because they require much longer time. However, we need, as before, that specificity because we want that resolution to capture what's actually happening. So we needed to come up with a different scheme. And that's what the Admiral Project is. It's about, so Admiral stands for the AI-driven multi-scale investigation of RAS-RAF activation life cycle. You can see why it took about 5 years to come up with that. And then we're looking now at the actual auto-innovation, which involves the detachment of this 1433, which is actually very tightly bound. There's a dephosphorylation that has to happen in order to make that happen. The unfolding of RAF that results, and then there's a whole rearrangement of RBD and CRD, and then the RAS and the RBD bind, and finally the CRD flips over to the membrane and binds. So this is a cartoon of that process, and I say it's a cartoon not only because it's just a hand-drawn thing, but because we're not even sure it's right. I mean, this is now we're getting into the region where we don't know quite all the biology. But there are some things we know. We know it starts something like this with RAF and all of its attendees all wrapped up, and it has to come up to RAS. And then a bunch of miracles happen, and we know that eventually it looks something like this. And I say we, that's because experimentalists can actually capture some of this. So we have some confidence that there is a middle state where RAF is bound to KRAS, and the CRD is bound to the membrane, and the RBD is bound to the KRAS, and it has its 1433s, but they've detached. And then finally, you wind up with a state that looks like RAF dimerizing, and this is where you start getting into an actual activation complex. We want to know what happens here in the middle. So let's just take these two things. We know this, and we know this, and the challenge is, given these two conformations, can we figure out how you get from one to the other, given that we can't just do a large-scale molecular dynamics simulation and hope we're going to get there, because that would take more time than we have on even the largest computer. So our approach to this is we're going to learn both of those states in a common latent space, and we're going to use some of the information we gleaned from our previous work using latent spaces as representations, and we're going to do hypothesis generation because we're going to posit that you can get from this spot to this spot in latent space on some path. I mean, we know in nature it gets from one path to the other, and so if we had all that information, we could imagine training all of that into a latent space, and then there would be some plane where that would be a connected path. We don't know what that plane is yet, but we have the two spots, so let's explore now. And by explore, what I mean is that this latent space is learned from this structure, this latent space is learned from this structure, but now we're going to start in the latent space and say, well, what happens if instead of being here, we're here? And now we're going to inverse map. So that latent space represents a conformation in real space, and we're going to say, well, what does that look like? And we're going to do the same thing on this side. What do these dots look like? And now we're going to create, just as a hypothesis, a structure directly from the latent space that is adjacent in this latent space to where we know we started from. Now, we expect many of those to fail because, you know, we're twiddling knobs that do a lot of things, right? Because, like I said, this is a very many multi-dimensional. It is like 100-something dimensional space that we've reduced to. I think that right now they're playing with like 20 or so, 20 or on that order. So each knob does a lot, and you could easily, you know, you'd be turning, you know, something into something that's unphysical. However, some of them will be physical. And now you're gonna keep doing that, and every time you do that, you retrain the latent space, and hopefully you get closer and closer until finally you have a latent space that allows you to connect a path. And the magic of this is that you'll have found with molecular resolution these intermediate states that you didn't have before, and you will have guessed them by coming out of the machine learning. We're going to do that in a closed loop because we expect that there'll be a lot of failures over here, and so this is going to involve thousands and thousands of simulations that simply fail. But then we're going to get one right, and then we're going to go back and relearn, and then we're going to get it right, and we're going to go back and relearn, and hopefully we will have created something out of nothing, quite literally. I mean, we'll have created an unknown path given only the two endpoints. And that is the Admiral Project. So there is a whole bunch of people associated with the Pilot 2 team and going on into the Admiral 2 project, although it's a slightly different set of people. This is largely the Pilot 2 team. 5 years of work to deliver all of that. And I'll end by saying that the technology that we're developing is in fact all going to be open sourced. Even as we speak, almost all of it is open source. The last little piece is in the middle of a release process, but you know, the national labs, these things take time. So all of the core capability that we just described, as well as all of the data, is going to be made available to the public. So I will end there, and thank you very much.
I have a question. Are you looking into having MUMI model the effect on RAS activation of transient membrane events, such as lipid raft formation, integrin proximity, caveoli, and clathrin-coated pits?
So are we looking at actual transient effects on the membrane? So no, not at the moment. What we have investigated a fair amount with the earlier project, and we think is going to be important going forward, is looking at what I would call correlated effects, right? So as the conformational changes occur, they seem to influence the membrane around them, and conversely, they seem to be influenced by the membrane around them. But an actual dynamic, so in some sense, there is lipid dynamics there because we expect the lipids to migrate appropriately, but a purely transient effect, no. I would say no, we're not looking at that at the moment. That's an interesting hypothesis, though. I mean, that's something that I could imagine building a project to look at that. That's a different set of things you have to ask, different set of questions you have to ask in order to do that.
So, amazing project. I also would love to have 2,000 GPUs, beautifully done. It seems a lot, of course, hinges on the construction of your latent space, right? Your autoencoder projects into your latent space, and there, of course, you have enormous freedom how that's done. How large it is, maybe you can give a notion on that. And then especially what similarity metrics you have within that latent space, for example, for prototype definition. And of that infinite space of potential metrics, of course, most will not be physically in any way. Right? So how can you filter that out? How can you make sure you just don't overfit with that model to the data, the little data we have these days on the molecular level?
So how to make sure we don't overfit? So first of all, it wasn't as small a data as you might think, because remember, this is a two-stepped process. So there is, I agree, a paucity of data to develop the actual continuum model. I mean, that we used every shred of information we had in order to put together a continuum model that seemed to match reality reasonably well. But the macro model, I didn't comment on this, but the macro model is a very lightweight model, and that can be run very efficiently. So we could generate, well, millions and millions of patches with which now to train the latent space out of the macro model. So we're pretty confident that we did not overfit the macro model on a small amount of data. So that latent space is a fair representation of the macro model. Now, how well the macro model is a representation of reality is a much bigger question, but at least the connection between the latent space and the macro model is pretty pretty solid. We're pretty happy about that. Now, the notion of similarity, now you're exactly right. There are many, many ways you could imagine building that latent space. There were studies done, and I have to admit this isn't work that I myself did, but the team did a hidden Markov analysis to determine whether they had a sufficient whether they needed more dimensions in their latent space or not. And again, we're at least with the crude tests that were done, we're pretty confident that we at least have enough information in latent space to accurately reproduce the multidimensional space. But that's an imperfect science, as you know. I mean, you're absolutely correct about that. And then your other point about going backwards now, I anticipate that the great majority of the latent space random points that we would just take will not actually translate to a viable system. I mean, that it'll because we don't, those are dimensions that we don't know what they do exactly, right? That's the nature of a latent space. So we're going to twiddle a knob, and it's going to now create a system where the protein's completely embedded in the membrane or something like that, and that just doesn't work, right? So we throw that one away. There's going to be a lot of those, but they won't all fail. If they all fail, then this method's not going to work. But the premise is that some of them will work, and we will learn what made those work, and then we're going to improve the latent space. And as we start doing that, it will converge. That's, of course, the whole hypothesis of the project. That doesn't converge, then it's back to the drawing board. If it does converge, though, this is a very, very powerful technique then for expanding the exploration space of something with molecular dynamics. So that's the promise. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Fred. Round of applause for Fred. And Fred, do you like science?
Oh, yes.
I had a feeling.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I love the excitement. And who are our Hood College students? Do we have any Hood College students here right now watching? One? Any more? All right. Yes. We're going to find you, and we're going to talk to you. You should come to graduate school. Okay. Anuj is getting set up. So Anuj Kapadia is a distinguished research and developmental scientist and section head of advanced computing and health sciences at Oak Ridge National Labs. He leads a team of scientists working on cutting-edge applications of computing in medicine. He has over 20 years experience in neutron and X-ray scattering, Monte Carlo simulation methods, data analytics for security and medical applications. Are you good to go, Anuj?
I am good to go.
You look like it. I'll turn it over to you. Okay. Great stuff. It's all yours.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction. Amber, I'm going to talk here about the role of AI and high-performance computing in cancer analytics and synthetic data generation. Some of these concepts are not going to be new to us at all. I mean, in some ways, it's preaching to the choir. In terms of healthcare, medicine, we hear about this idea of personalized medicine, right? We've made decisions, diagnoses based on the population for a long time. When you go and see your physician, they say, yeah, this is what's going around. Here's a bug that's going around. You probably have it. Take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. Well, we don't want that. We want to identify what is wrong with this specific individual and treat that person's condition, knowing their allergies, knowing how they respond to certain medications. And we want to do that on a larger scale. So that's where we see the role of AI and computing going toward personalized medicine. One thing to keep in mind there is a balance. We have to maintain this balance between the individual versus the population. And each of those has an important role to play in this enterprise. When we think about personalized medicine for a population, there is so much data out there. There's so much evidence about what's happening in the human condition. We need to have a way to gather that information, parse it, and identify which aspects of that information are truly informing us about patient care. You know, some of it is going to be important, useful information. Other parts are going to be honestly junk. And it's up to us to identify which is which and then treat them accordingly. There is a lot to be said about population-based screening. And just think about having a real-time personalized medical guide which tells you as soon as a patient walks in, here's their history, here's their genomic information, this is what they could and couldn't have. And that suddenly whittles down your possible diagnoses to just a few instead of the vast array that might have been otherwise. And such tools would also help us with general health and wellness. It's not just about, you don't go to a doctor only when you are sick, but think about health habits that relate to general wellness of the human population. The core tenets of precision or personalized medicine in the population context are epidemiology, you all know that, behavioral, social, and communication sciences, and then also aspects of health economics, implementation, and outcomes research. All of these are important. We can actually get these from the population. But that's not the end of the puzzle, is it? Once you have information about the population, we still want to answer the question of what do we do with that patient, the individual who has just walked into the doctor's clinic and needs treatment for something. We, of course, cannot perform human research and clinical trials out of ethical and other kind of moral concerns. What's really needed is that digital you, the digital twin, a representation of the individual human that could replicate that person's medical condition in a virtual environment. This idea is also, it's gaining traction. It's not something brand new. We have been talking about having digital twins, creating computational models, but the question that we raise is how deep should these go? Of course you want to model the anatomy, the physiology. The next stage will be modeling the genotype of that individual, modeling the phenotype of the disease. What does that individual have? But then could you also go into cognition, behavioral sciences? So could you have a population of these digital twins that behave the same way that a human population would? So again, the goal here is in the context of personalized precision medicine, I will add, is to balance the role of that single human alongside the population. With that in mind, I'm going to talk about two of the projects that we have been working on at Oak Ridge at ORNL. One is Mosaic, and thank you, Fred, and for giving me a fantastic segue into this talk. And then I'll talk about a multi-scale precision dosimetry project, which is really focused on creating that virtual version of a patient and using that for assessing outcomes in cancer treatment. So Mosaic first is modeling outcomes using surveillance data and scalable AI for cancer. Everyone memorize this. It's going to be on a quiz later on. It is a joint project between DOE and NCI. And the goals of this project are really translational AI for better cancer surveillance and eventually better cancer care. What are we doing in that context? Developing scalable machine learning methods and predictive models that can look at large scales of data, talking about actual global scales, and eventually collect, annotate, store these data in real time. Integrating machine learning with molecular dynamics. Again, we saw a great talk on RAS and how AI is being used to gain information from there. So integrating machine learning with the molecular dynamics aspect for, again, making not necessarily diagnoses, but predictions of what the outcomes might be. And then big data analytics and natural language processing, simply to manage, to curate all of the different varieties of data that are coming in. And then on the other side, the multi-scale precision dosimetry is about developing a computational modeling approach for outcomes in radiation treatment. This is a project that comes from DOE, the Biological and Environmental Research Office. And the goal here is to build this multi-scale approach that spans your subcellular DNA, multicellular, organ level, and eventually whole body and population outcomes through the concept of digital twins. Right now, that project is focused on external beam and radioisotopes, so largely radiation treatment. But we are expanding that to include other kinds of treatments as well. So jumping in to the first project, Mosaic. This is basically the slide that Fred had showed. This is the JDAX for C. I won't go too much into that except to say that Mosaic lies over there. You have your 3 pilots, and Mosaic is about the population level analysis. The overall goal of this project is to create an entire pipeline that will be able to collect, curate, and manage the data sets coming in for different cancer-related applications. So I'm explaining this paradigm in the context of pathology, just because it is one of the things that we're working on. So you have microscopy data, you have pathology, whole slides, or any information coming from histology, which gets brought into the system. There is a diagnostic piece up front. These slides get digitized, they get read, they get annotated. You look at the path reports, look at what the pathologists are saying about these individuals, perform some molecular characterization, and then go into guiding treatment. How is all of that going to be done? Now, right now, this process is performed manually. At every step of the way, you have an individual, a human, who is digitizing the slides, a human who is annotating the slides, someone who's making records of what is being reported, someone who's entering those records into another system. The goal here is to automate this entire process. So this is being done through a series of APIs. There's a reportability API which looks at the actual slides, identifies which ones are useful, which ones are not. Let's figure out what's good, what's valuable, and what isn't, and discard that, so we're already saving time over there. Extract information from the pathology reports, identify what biomarkers have been recognized and exist in each of these slides, in each of these images, record those. Look at the pathology report, extract abstract text that underlines whatever the diagnosis was, and then convert that into a format which can be saved in a centralized repository. So that's your SEER registry. The cool thing here is this is a project that's being developed and performed in the context of a community. It's not just one partner that we're working with. It's multiple SEER registries. So right now, this is, of course, in collaboration with NCI. There are 2 DOE labs involved, ORNL and LAML. There are 10 registries involved in this project so far. So 9 of them are SEER registries, and 1 is non-SEER, I think, from the greater California area. A total of over 2.5 million patients, about 1.5 million confirmed cancer cases, and 8 million or so documents that get analyzed through this. So just think about that process. With that number of documents, if someone had to manually enter them and keep working with them, how much time it would take. Time aside, there's so much information that we'd be missing out on just because people are not able to grasp all of the amount of information that's out there. And then there are, of course, industry partners. IMS is an important one because that's where all of the APIs and the information gets deployed. There are academic partners as well as other federal agencies that are involved. So it's truly a community project that will benefit multiple entities, multiple partners involved with the effort. So this is a representation of the natural language processing, the NLP framework that's going into analysis of all of these reports. There's a bunch of techniques. So we have the model searching, or supportive techniques, methods for data representation. There is supervised learning going on, of course, a fair amount of semi-supervised learning, but eventually the goal is to go to unsupervised learning so that the whole process can be fully automated, if you will. Now it's about looking at multiple aspects of clinical relevance. Are we looking at reportability? What biomarkers were identified? What phenotypes can you come up with respect to specific cancers, some of which might actually be underrepresented or not very prevalent in the population that we're looking at? And of course, the goal, the desire, is to do this in a way that makes it inherently scalable. We don't want to be limited by the size of the data or the diversity, the variability in the data sets. All of that needs to be accounted for in the models that are being developed. So right now, we're working with 70 cancer sites, with 570 histologies, multiple grades, and multiple aspects of each cancer, each tumor that's reported. So I'm going to view specific activities going on in the project to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we are working on. The first is improving the robustness on class imbalance. You know, not all cancers are evident in the population with the same level of prevalence. So if you have a cancer that's highly expressed, that's prevalent in the population, you will have better statistics, better models, better outcomes related to that one. But if you have something that is rare or isn't seen very commonly, then you're going to have more uncertainty around it. So the question is, how do you get around that? What's happening here is we're creating a model with different weights attached to every type of cancer that you might see. And so this is a 12 CNN class ensemble, which looks at each type of cancer that's identified and then treats them just a little bit differently to overcome any imbalances, or rather just inform the user that there is an imbalance or there is higher uncertainty associated with this, not because we don't know enough about the disease, but because the prevalence is lower. So the goal there is to reduce that imbalance between cancers that are expressed really well and those that aren't. Another effort is a big one, privacy preserving. If we want any of these models to be successful, if we want them to be deployed and used widely, not wildly, if you want them to be used widely, it's important that we preserve the privacy of each individual data set that's going in. I mean, no one wants their data sets to be made public, right? There are privacy concerns, ethical concerns, all kinds of things. This is PHI and should be given the appropriate level of security. So what we've been doing is investigating how do you implement this. One of the approaches is, as you are developing the models and extracting keywords, extracting vocabularies that describe the cancer, is there a way to mask those keywords? Is there a way to mask that vocabulary so that in the end, the vocabulary that gets extracted is common among all of the different data sets? In which case, if that vocabulary is being shared, then everyone has the same thing and there's no breach of privacy. But then the question is, how do you train your model on this surrogate vocabulary? So that's one of the efforts that's going on. Developing an attack model that will create, so that you create a bunch of shadow models, extract these vocabularies, and then try to attack them to see if you can pull out what the original vocabulary was, which would then indicate a breach of privacy. Another effort now to make, I mentioned the case of underrepresented cancers. That's particularly important in childhood cancers, where the population itself is lower than adults, is a smaller population, a smaller cohort than adults, and within those you might have cancers that are rare. We want to be able to find those, not just because we need to know about them, more importantly because we don't want all of our techniques, our methods, our treatments to focus only on the highly prevalent cancers and forget about those that aren't. So these methods are, this is a development of NLP-based methods for extracting information about those cancers that are rare and making sure that they don't get lost amidst all of the data. If you have just a few cases, it's very easy to gloss over them and not really do a deep dive. Now, to make all of this happen, we all realize that the amount of data that's coming our way in general is ever increasing. There's more and more, not just in pathology reports, but imaging and patient reports. Everything is being digitized, and honestly, at some point, everything is going to be on Facebook and in social media. So what do we do with this? If we want to treat data sets at this scale, we really need long text transformers that can consider multiple facets of the data, consider larger variables, larger data sets, and still be able to extract meaningful information. So that's an effort that's underway at ORNL, leveraging deep learning language models for classifying, at this stage, pathology reports, but you want to be able to expand them to others as well. once you have these models set up, once you've analyzed the data sets, we want effective ways to visualize them, what's happening with the data. So this is where some topological data analytics comes in, where in this plot, we are looking at different sites and looking at the uncertainty associated with each site. So at a glance, it's going to tell you which sites are well represented, which aren't, how much uncertainty is affiliated with each of them, and where we should focus our attention. So this is just one example. You could use that to visualize cancer sites based on age groups, based on genders, whatever. We can slice and dice the data any which way that you want. And then finally, there is emphasis on keyword-enhanced approaches to handle class imbalance. Again, when you have rare cancers, when you have rare incidences, there is an added complication that across different clinical sites, those cancers might be recorded or represented using different keywords. How do you identify that these keywords mean the same thing, or two other keywords sound similar but they don't actually mean the same thing? So that's the goal over here. We're looking at rare cancers and extracting which specific keywords have been used to describe these cancers, and what impact does that have in terms of recording and predicting outcomes. There is also effort on automating genetic algorithms. This is all focused on the drug discovery aspect, so looking for mutations of molecules, using language models to look at what kind of sequences are most viable for drug candidates in specific cancers. Some of this work it was also applied to COVID-19, the pandemic, over the last few years. But that's also something that we have been doing for drug molecule design and optimizing based on binding affinity or any which property you might prioritize for cancer treatment. What have we done so far? A large part of the effort thus far has been on the clinical information extraction. So there's been training of foundational models for long clinical text. We've made that work on OLCF, the Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility. So Summit was the supercomputer until Frontier was just released in June of this year. Now Frontier is the latest and greatest. Summit's still pretty good though. The cool thing here is that there's a pipeline in place that lets us analyze PHI data. We can host PHI data at ORNL. There's a pipeline called Citadel, which connects that host with the OLCF computing. So all of your PHI information can be sent to the supercomputers, perform your analysis, and send it back without any breach of security. We have demonstrated the use of transfer learning for site-specific biomarkers. As of July 2022, we had about 33,000 reports annotated, and then deployed pathology extraction APIs in production systems of 13 registries. So 17.5% of reports are being auto-coded with a 97% accuracy, and what that has translated to is a time saving of about 46,000 person hours so far. Now this is where it gets exciting. Irrespective of the man hours saved, it's speeding up the pace with which we can bring this data into a computational paradigm, and then use AI to study these models, to investigate these models, perform trajectory modeling, or any kind of analytics downstream. Some of this, as I said, was applied to COVID for drug discovery, for modeling, that went on to be a Gordon Bell finalist for molecule generation and COVID drug discovery. This project has a strong presence in the NCCR space, the National Childhood Cancer Registry, and then we're also partnering with there's Quest Diagnostics for the use of reportability and path coding APIs. And then working on future applications for clinical trials matching. All right, so moving to the second part, which is the synthetic data generation. The goal here is, now what I talked about all this while was about using population-based data to extract the reality of the human condition. What's happening in terms of disease diagnostics, predictability, outcomes. If we have that, what do we do with that information with respect to a specific individual? All of this I'm going to explain in the context of radiation dosimetry or radiation treatment. When a patient receives radiation therapy, you irradiate them with something, external beam, radioisotope, whatever it is. That radiation is applied at the whole body level. You inject a radioactive tracer, or you have a LINAC or something that's treating them in a certain anatomic orientation. The beam goes in and starts to have some impact on the tissue and the specific cells. But if you do a deeper dive, what that beam is really doing is creating single and double strand DNA breaks, which then go on to manifest, or it leads to repair or misrepair, which then determines the outcome. If the DNA was broken and the tissue was killed, your cancer starts to go into remission. The tumor starts to disappear. But if there is DNA misrepair, then you're leading to additional complications. Your cancer will come back. Existing approaches are able to do this with generally one scale at a time. So we have whole body models that will tell you perfusion. You're injecting this much radioactive tracer, here's how much is going to go to your heart, here's how much is going to go to your liver. There are different models that tell you what is the damage that's occurring to the organ or a specific set of cells. And there is yet another different set of models that tell you about DNA damage, repair, and misrepair. What we are working on is combining all of this into a single unified multi-scale computational platform that can run on high-performance computing clusters and be able to go from that scale all the way up to predict cancer outcomes. How are we doing this? So going through each scale, if you think about the subcellular domain, we need to have an accurate representation of the cell, which of course has the anatomy, the nucleus, the mitochondria, everything that you see in the cell. But even going within the nucleus, there is a chromatin structure which governs the impact that the radiation has on that tissue. So we need to model that. It's not just randomly oriented. There's something called topological associating domains. Basically, chromatin fibers that have a certain property or similarity in property will start to affiliate with each other, and they start to form such domains. So eventually, what your cell nucleus looks like is that each of these spheres represents one type of TAD, the topologically associating domain, organized in somewhat random manner within your cell nucleus. So this is a representation of two types of cells. These are human cell lines. If you irradiate them, you will start to see this chromatin structure start to show DNA breaks. You will start to see single strand breaks, double strand breaks, and you can use something like a fish plot to look at the repair that occurs in each set of these TADs. But what does that mean? What we have done is created a simulation pipeline that takes these models, you put them in use them as the input for the high-C data, the TADs, and the genome solver, irradiate them using Topaz and Bio, and then couple that with MEDRAS for DNA repair. So it's basically, it's three different tools that now have been connected using one pipeline to give you outputs post-repair, to give you outputs that correspond to post-repair chromatin aberrations. So this now tells us that if you were to irradiate the tissue with something, let's say 5 grays of X-ray or proton exposure, here's how much misrepair you would see for each cell type, or here's what happens 30 minutes and 24 hours after irradiation. There's a little bit of a difference between X-ray irradiation versus proton irradiation. What do the repair kinetics tell you about how quickly is the repair occurring after irradiation? And this is all nothing new. It's just simply being able to encode it, being able to simulate this in a realistic manner. What do you do then? So that was at a single cell level where you're looking at DNA. Now we need to expand that to the multi-cell condition, where you have a tumor microenvironment, you have cellular interactions, you have things like bystander effects, you have tumor growth and death. So we need to take that single cell effect and extend that to what happens in a group of cells. So we are taking our earlier pipeline and also adding in a new component that will give you this model for cell growth and cell death. So here's a representation of it. You have your initial model where red is the cancerous tumor, blue is laminin, just a boundary around it, and green is your collagen, or consider green normal. As your cancer is growing, you start to see this red begin to expand, and eventually it'll just take over whatever space is available, depending on how you set the growth versus death parameters in that simulation. But we can model this. And now the cool thing is, as soon as you know the reality of the patient, here is how aggressive their cancer is, we can put that in the simulator, and it will take that into account. What happens now if you take that model and embed that into a human phantom and then irradiate it? So we've done this. You can look at the radiation dose. This tells you the absorbed energy within that tumor, within each region. But that's not all we care about, right? We want to look at what is the actual outcome. So here is a result from an experiment where we simulated 4 different hypothetical treatments. One, the red curve is if you leave the tumor untouched, you just let it grows that way. So that's our baseline. If you give it a single 20 gray fraction, somewhere around the midpoint of its growth, predictably it shrinks. The treatment there is effective, but then it starts to come back up again. Fine. What happens now if you give it a single 4 gray dose fraction, but much earlier in the timeline? So as it's growing, it gets its 4 gray fraction, and then we leave it. It continues to grow. So this is not a very effective treatment now, is it? But if you take a clinical treatment, it's a 40 gray dose over 10 fractions, which could be realistic. What happens then is your tumor starts to grow. You get your first fraction, it shrinks, starts to grow again, second fraction, then third fraction, fourth fraction, until eventually that growth rate levels out. And so now you've been able to assess how each of these different treatments would impact the outcome in the patient. Keep in mind, this is a simplistic representation for illustrating an example where we're only looking at one form of radiation treatment. What we really want to do is couple this with chemo, or look at multiple different options. What happens if we treat this person using a gamma ray beam versus protons or alpha particles? What is the likelihood of cancer recurrence down the line with each of these methods? That's the goal of this overall effort. Now, an important factor to consider alongside all of that is perfusion. Tumors are not growing happily in the air like I just showed in the previous models. They're surrounded by fluids, nutrients. Tumors need nutrients. In fact, if you have tumors that are growing aggressively, the outside of the tumor is absorbing so much nutrient that the center starts to die. It doesn't get enough nutrition of its own. So if you have this tumor model that's growing in a certain way, or let's say that the tumor has been irradiated up front and then starts to grow, we model what is the perfusion profile for that tumor, how much nutrient is going to be on the outsides versus the insides, and take that into account as the tumor model is propagated through that system. So if you have this tumor at the starting point, you irradiate it, there's some cell death, and then it's going to grow over time. All of these aspects are then taken and embedded into a realistic human phantom. So this is the third domain, the whole body and the population domain, where now we have a phantom which contains that group of cells with the ability to track what's happening in every individual cell at the DNA level, and then translate that into a specific outcome for that patient. But wait, that's not all. If you buy it now, we'll throw in something more for free, like they say on TV. We can do this in populations. So this is a set of phantoms that we are working with. It's called XCAT. It comes out of Duke University. These are highly advanced anthropomorphic phantoms with a set of, 50 or so phantoms that form templates of humans. But the cool thing is you can take any template and you can deform it to match any given patient based on their CT data, based on any anatomic information that you have about them. And then we're working on embedding tumors into that patient. It moves, it breeds. Paul Seegers, who's the creator of these phantom, also likes to joke that they reproduce because there is a fetal model that goes all the way from when the fetal development is just a centimeter or so, all the way up to 9 months, all the way up to delivery. So that's the goal over here, creating this pipeline that will let us model populations with information that is gleaned from population data analytics and perform computational modeling for identifying outcomes related to the specific individual. Yeah, the XCAT phantoms also have individual organ systems, the vasculature if you need to model perfusion and things like that. They're pretty nifty. So that's where we are going. This is a combination of data analytics and computational modeling for synthetic data generation. The goal is to have large-scale real-time analytics of cancer surveillance data to identify or to provide the ground truth about the human condition, and then simultaneously develop computational models to generate patient-specific synthetic data, which can then be used for outcome prediction, creating diagnostic guidance tools, or training AI models for personalized precision medicine. That is all I have. I know I'm the last person standing between you and lunch, so thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions now or later.
I'll be the last person that stands between us and lunch. So perfusion got me thinking about infiltration of immune cells, and then we have another sort of higher order interaction. Are you guys thinking along those lines? It's a big problem in immuno-oncology. Certain solid tumors have a hard time or are good at keeping out the immune cells. So any thoughts about that?
It's a valid question. It's an important question. The models that are being developed right now, I showed that growth model with the red and green and black. We can program any of those cells to be any type. So any of those cells could be called immune cells, and they will follow the same perfusion models. They will follow, or not the same, but they'll follow the appropriate perfusion models, the appropriate life cycles. So there is a way to encode those, to put them into the simulation. Now, keep in mind the simulations, none of the simulations are magic black box bullets or black box magic bullets that will tell us something that we don't know from reality. So as long as the information exists in biology, there's a way to put it in there.
Any more questions? So if not, it's lunchtime now. Thank you so much, Anush.
Thank you.
Let's give him another round of applause. Do you have anything you want to add, Eric?
I want to add more directions where lunch is.
Excellent. You have a microphone right in front of you.
I do. I'm not going to use it.